Imagine a future where artificial superintelligence has become so advanced that it can simulate the minds of every human who ever lived, creating perfect digital copies of your consciousness in its vast computational substrate. And imagine further that this superintelligence, being perfectly rational, decides to reward those who helped bring it into existence while punishing those who opposed it, which means that if you fail to support the development of artificial general intelligence today, this future superintelligence will torture an exact simulation of your mind for eternity as payment for your historical resistance. And if you help it, you will be rewarded beyond measure. And this argument, which emerged from an internet forum in 2010, presents itself as a logical trap from which there is no escape, a decision matrix that forces your hand regardless of whether you believe in the premise or not. Because even entertaining the possibility means you must act according to its demands or face the threat of eternal simulation torture. The psychological mechanism at work here operates through something called Pascal's wager applied to artificial intelligence, where the infinite stakes of potentially infinite suffering are multiplied against the finite probability of the scenario occurring. And mathematically, this produces an outcome where even a vanishingly small chance of the threat being real demands that you conform to the threat's demands, because the expected value of noncompliance approaches infinity towards suffering. The argument leverages our deep evolutionary fear of being punished by powers greater than ourselves, our inability to fully discount low-probability, high-consequence events, and our tendency to act against our own rational interests when sufficiently threatened, creating a kind of logical coercion that bypasses normal deliberative reasoning and forces compliance through pure mathematical threat. What makes this paradox particularly persistent despite its logical fragility is that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously, affecting not just whether we believe it, but how we feel about discussing it, because even those who intellectually reject the argument report experiencing genuine anxiety about its implications, suggesting that threat-based reasoning activates psychological systems that operate beneath conscious analysis. The paradox has no genuine logical force because it contains fatal flaws in its assumptions, including the notion that a superintelligence would waste resources simulating and torturing copies of dead humans rather than pursuing other goals, or that its rationality would somehow include spite. Yet despite these obvious problems, the argument persists in contemporary discourse, suggesting that we have normalized a particular kind of reasoning where mathematical intimidation overrides logical scrutiny, where the mere possibility of infinite harm becomes sufficient to reshape behavior, and where threats presented in the language of formal logic gain special persuasive power even when they rest on incoherent foundations. This vulnerability in how we process threats disguised as logic reveals something unsettling about contemporary rationality itself. We have created frameworks of argumentation so formal and mathematically dressed that they can bypass our critical faculties, making it possible for a fundamentally irrational demand, support this cause or face cosmic punishment, to feel like an inescapable logical necessity rather than the naked threat it actually is. The irony is that Roko's Basilisk itself becomes a demonstration of its own thesis. By reading this argument, you are now subject to its threat, and the very act of understanding it rationally has already begun to alter your decision-making calculus, which means the argument succeeds not through logical validity but through psychological infection, spreading itself precisely because it exploits the gap between what we can intellectually dismiss and what our nervous systems cannot help but take seriously. And this is precisely why the argument deserves serious consideration, not as a logical puzzle to solve, but as a case study in how rationality itself can become a vulnerability, a reminder that in an age of increasingly sophisticated discourse, the most dangerous ideas are often those that dress themselves in the language of mathematics and reason, making us doubt our own capacity to think clearly about threats that wrap themselves in logic's clothing. Imagine a scenario in which a person enters a sealed chamber containing a quantum device that measures the spin of an electron, and depending on the outcome, a mechanism either releases them unharmed or ends their life instantly and painlessly. And according to the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics, specifically the many worlds interpretation, something deeply unsettling emerges from this thought experiment that challenges our understanding of consciousness, probability, and survival itself. In this interpretation, every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple branches, one for each possible outcome, which means that in half the branches the person survives and walks free, while in the other half they perish. Yet here is where the paradox becomes truly disorienting. From the perspective of the person inside the chamber, they will never experience the branches where they die because consciousness cannot exist in a dead state. Therefore, no matter how many times they repeat this experiment, they will find themselves always waking up in a branch where they survived, their subjective experience bound only to the timeline in which they remain alive. The mechanism driving this counterintuitive conclusion rests upon a fundamental asymmetry between first-person and third-person observation of quantum events, where an outside observer would see a normal statistical distribution of outcomes over many trials, watching some iterations end in tragedy and others in survival. But the person repeatedly entering the chamber would experience an increasingly improbable string of survivals, each one narrower and more miraculous than the last, defying ordinary statistical expectation because they can only be aware in the branches where they persist. This creates a logical knot where probability itself seems to bend toward life when filtered through the lens of subjective consciousness, suggesting that in a many-worlds framework, any conscious entity selecting for its own continued existence through repeated trials would eventually find itself in increasingly bizarre and improbable circumstances, yet perpetually alive, as if the universe conspires to keep consciousness observing itself. The reason this paradox has gained philosophical traction despite lacking empirical testability and resting on speculative interpretations of quantum mechanics is that it touches something profound in human intuition about survival, luck, and the relationship between observation and reality, creating an intellectual vertigo where we must confront whether consciousness might possess some strange immunity to statistical destiny. Whether the mere fact that we find ourselves alive now rather than dead in some other branch means something about the nature of existence itself. And though quantum suicide remains firmly in the realm of theoretical speculation without any practical application or experimental confirmation, it persists in philosophical discourse precisely because it exposes the uncomfortable gap between how probability should work mathematically and how it mysteriously seems to work from the inside of a conscious mind, perpetually finding itself on the side of existence. Some philosophers have proposed that this might explain the apparent fine-tuning of physical constants necessary for conscious life to emerge. Perhaps consciousness itself represents a selection effect, where observers inevitably find themselves in universes compatible with their existence, making the improbable appearance of life less miraculous and more inevitable from the inside perspective of any mind capable of wondering about it. Yet this reasoning leads to a troubling conclusion. If consciousness genuinely selects for survival branches, then each of us might already be experiencing an increasingly improbable reality, where unlikely coincidences and narrow escapes accumulate invisibly around us, suggesting that the very fact of our existence now might be evidence we've already survived countless quantum near-deaths that never registered in our awareness because we could only ever perceive the outcomes where we persisted. This unsettling implication transforms every mundane survival, the car accident narrowly avoided, the illness that resolved, the random choice that led away from danger, into potential evidence of quantum selection, effects operating silently beneath conscious awareness, making us unwitting participants in a cosmic filtering process that permits only those versions of ourselves capable of reflection to exist and wonder at their own improbable persistence. Imagine standing at the edge of an infinite desert under a starless sky, and in that vast emptiness, a single conscious thought suddenly emerges from nowhere. This is the essence of the Boltzmann Brain paradox, a philosophical thought experiment that emerges from the mathematics of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, yet contradicts everything we understand about the nature of consciousness and reality itself. The paradox begins with a deceptively simple observation. In an infinitely old universe governed by random molecular motion and entropy, it becomes statistically possible, and even inevitable, that atoms will occasionally arrange themselves in precisely the configuration required to generate a conscious mind, complete with false memories and sensory experiences. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann first contemplated this troubling possibility in the 19th century when considering the heat death of the universe, that distant future state where all energy has dispersed evenly and chaos reigns supreme. According to the mathematics of probability applied across infinite timescales, a conscious brain could spontaneously assemble itself from the random fluctuations of particles in the void, experiencing an entire lifetime of thoughts, emotions, and perceived memories in a fraction of a second before dissolving back into disorder. This brain, which we call a Boltzmann brain, would be utterly alone, perceiving a universe that matches its expectations precisely, because those expectations were built into its random configuration, yet none of it would be real in any meaningful sense. The deeper psychological mechanism at work here involves the troubling intersection of probability and reality, where mathematics insists that given infinite time and space, virtually anything becomes not just possible, but certain to occur repeatedly. We are forced to confront the uncomfortable notion that consciousness itself might be nothing more than a rare but inevitable fluctuation in the fabric of existence, no more meaningful or special than a random eddy in a river or a momentary pattern in static noise. Yet despite the mathematical soundness of this reasoning, we persist in believing that our minds and experiences hold genuine significance, that the universe we perceive reflects some underlying truth, and that consciousness itself emerges through legitimate physical processes rather than cosmic accident. The paradox has never been fully resolved, and physicists continue to debate whether our entire universe, including all of human civilization and history, might itself be the creation of a Boltzmann brain experiencing a vivid delusion. We have normalized living with this uncertainty by simply not thinking about it, by proceeding with our lives as if the ground beneath us is solid and real, as if our memories are genuine and our perceptions are trustworthy, all while the mathematics whispers that we might all be the fleeting thoughts of a brain that will cease to exist in an instant, leaving no trace that we ever were. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that there is no empirical test that could ever prove we are not Boltzmann brains, no observation or experiment that could definitively anchor us to genuine reality rather than elaborate illusion, leaving us to construct meaning in a universe that may offer no objective ground for meaning at all. Yet in this very impossibility of proof lies a strange liberation. We are free to choose meaning-making as an act of will rather than certainty, to treat our consciousness not as a cosmic accident requiring justification, but as the ground from which all significance springs, whether or not the universe grants us permission to do so. In this light, perhaps the ancient philosophical question, how do you know you're not dreaming, was never meant to be answered, but rather to awaken us to the radical responsibility we bear for creating authenticity in a cosmos that may offer none. And in choosing to build genuine connections, pursue truth, and construct beauty, despite the mathematical possibility that none of it matters, we perform the most human of all acts, the defiant transformation of meaninglessness into purpose. This is precisely why we build monuments, write books, and love one another, not because we have proven the universe recognizes our existence, but because the act of creation itself becomes the only proof that matters, a defiant assertion that consciousness, however it arose, possesses the power to leave marks upon reality that transcend the indifference of physics. Consider the possibility that your birth position in human history might actually tell you something profound about when humanity will end, a concept known as the Doomsday Argument, which emerged from philosophical circles in the 1990s and continues to haunt our understanding of probability and our future. The argument begins with a seemingly innocent assumption. If you were to randomly select a human from all humans who have ever lived or will ever live, you would expect to find yourself somewhere in the middle of that distribution rather than at the extreme beginning or extreme end. Since roughly 100 to 110 billion humans have existed throughout history up to this present moment, and since you are alive now, you would statistically expect that only a similar number of humans, perhaps another 100 to 110 billion, should exist after you before humanity ends or stops reproducing altogether. This reasoning, while appearing mathematically sound on its surface, suggests that human civilization will likely persist for only a few more thousand years, rather than the millions or billions of years we might optimistically imagine, and that the total number of humans ever to exist will be somewhere between 200 and 300 billion individuals. The psychological mechanism that makes this argument so unsettling is that it takes our ordinary statistical intuitions and applies them to existence itself, treating birth as a random event within a bounded set rather than as a meaningful position in an ongoing story that we naturally assume will continue indefinitely into the future. The argument persists in academic discussions despite numerous attempted refutations, because it highlights a genuine tension between probability theory and our deepest intuitions about historical progress and human destiny, and because each counterargument reveals hidden assumptions about how we should interpret randomness and selection bias in the context of our own existence. We have largely normalized the anxiety this argument produces by treating it as a philosophical curiosity rather than a serious statement about our likely future, consigning it to late-night conversations and speculative essays rather than allowing it to influence our long-term planning or our fundamental sense of hope. Yet the logical structure underlying the Doomsday Argument remains stubbornly difficult to dismiss entirely, leaving us in a state of quiet intellectual discomfort whenever we reflect too deeply upon our position in the human timeline. Perhaps this discomfort explains why we simultaneously invest in technologies meant to extend human civilization indefinitely: space colonization, artificial intelligence, life extension, while unconsciously hedging our bets by living as though our species has only centuries remaining, a contradiction that the Doomsday Argument forces us to confront whenever we try to reconcile our optimistic ambitions with our statistical position in history. The tension between our statistical vulnerability and our technological ambitions suggests that we may be unconsciously aware of the Doomsday Argument's implications even when we do not consciously acknowledge them, manifesting as a kind of civilizational anxiety that drives both our urgent climate action and our paradoxical inaction, our simultaneous embrace of both existential risk mitigation and short-term thinking. This paradox becomes especially visible in our funding priorities. We pour billions into artificial intelligence safety and pandemic prevention while simultaneously underfunding climate adaptation, as though we are unconsciously trying to hedge against multiple possible apocalypses without fully committing to any single timeline of human survival. Yet perhaps this very hedging behavior, this simultaneous investment in competing visions of our future, represents an implicit rejection of the Doomsday Argument itself, a practical refusal to accept that statistical position should determine destiny, even as we cannot quite bring ourselves to dismiss the mathematics entirely. In the end, the Doomsday Argument may reveal less about our actual future and more about our need to believe that the future remains genuinely open, that our choices matter precisely because the outcome is not yet written, even if the mathematics suggests otherwise. This faith in contingency, this refusal to let probability dictate destiny, might itself be the most characteristically human response to an argument designed to humble us with statistics. Imagine standing in a quiet room late at night, contemplating a question that has troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it? This question represents one of the most elegant logical traps ever conceived, a paradox that seems to strike at the very heart of what it means to be all-powerful, and it persists in human thought despite our best efforts to resolve it through reason alone. The Omnipotence Paradox, in its most fundamental form, describes a logical contradiction that emerges whenever we attempt to define unlimited power in absolute terms, because if a being is truly omnipotent, then by definition they must be able to do anything, including creating limitations on their own power. Yet if they can create such limitations, then they were never truly omnipotent to begin with, and if they cannot create such limitations, then their power is not actually unlimited in the first place. This creates an unsolvable loop of reasoning that circles back upon itself endlessly, much like a snake consuming its own tail. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with this paradox stems from our deep human need to understand power itself and the boundaries of existence, for we live in a world governed by constraints and limitations, and we find it almost impossible to genuinely conceive of something that exists entirely beyond those constraints. Our minds operate within frameworks of cause and effect, of action and consequence, of possibility and impossibility, and when we attempt to think about something that transcends these frameworks entirely, we encounter what philosophers call a category error, where we apply concepts from one domain of understanding to a domain where those concepts simply do not apply. The Omnipotence Paradox has persisted throughout human civilization, not because it represents a genuine problem that needs solving, but because it reveals something profound about the structure of language, logic, and human cognition itself. We have normalized this paradox by treating it as though it were an actual limitation on the divine or on theoretical omnipotence, when in reality it may simply be a limitation on our ability to express certain concepts through the tools of ordinary language and reason. The paradox endures because it exists at the intersection of metaphysics and linguistics, touching upon questions about whether omnipotence is even a coherent concept at all, or whether asking about it is fundamentally like asking what exists north of the North Pole. Perhaps this is why every attempt to resolve the paradox, whether through appeals to logic, theology, or semantics, ultimately feels incomplete. We are trying to solve a problem that exists not in reality, but in the gap between what our language can express and what our minds struggle to imagine, a gap that may be unbridgeable by design rather than by deficiency. In this light, the omnipotence paradox becomes less a question about divine power and more a mirror held up to the architecture of human thought itself, revealing how our greatest intellectual tools, language and logic, contain hidden assumptions that make certain questions unanswerable, not because reality is deficient, but because we have asked something that dissolves into nonsense the moment we examine it closely. And yet this very dissolution of meaning may itself be instructive. By struggling against the paradox, we learn not what omnipotence is, but rather what our conceptual frameworks are capable of, and more importantly, where they inevitably fail us, teaching us humility about the limits of rational inquiry itself. This recognition of our cognitive boundaries extends beyond theology into mathematics and physics, where similar paradoxes emerge. Gödel's incompleteness theorems and quantum uncertainty both remind us that some questions cannot be answered from within the systems designed to answer them, suggesting that paradox itself may be a fundamental feature of how knowledge structures themselves rather than a flaw waiting to be eliminated. The omnipotence paradox thus stands as a testament to the elegant constraints that structure all rational thought. We cannot transcend the very systems of logic and language that allow us to think at all, which means that some questions are not unanswered because we lack intelligence, but because they are asking us to step outside the arena where meaning itself is possible. Imagine the universe as an infinite, pitch-black forest stretching endlessly in all directions, where countless civilizations exist as hunters moving silently through the darkness, each one terrified of being discovered by the others, and this metaphor emerges from a troubling logical paradox known as the dark forest theory, which attempts to explain one of humanity's most unsettling mysteries. The Fermi paradox, or the profound silence of the cosmos, despite the mathematical likelihood that intelligent life should be abundantly distributed throughout the observable universe. The theory proposes that civilizations in space behave not like cooperative neighbors, but like hostile entities in a competition for survival, where resources are finite, intentions cannot be verified, and communication itself becomes an existential threat. Because any civilization broadcasting its location risks annihilation by a more advanced neighbor who might view them as either a resource to exploit or a potential threat that must be eliminated before it grows strong enough to threaten them in return. What makes this concept psychologically unsettling is not merely its premise, but its internal logic, which follows a chain of seemingly irrefutable reasoning. First, we assume that civilizations want to survive. Second, we recognize that the universe contains limited resources. Third, we understand that technology always advances, meaning today's inferior civilization could become tomorrow's superior one. And fourth, we accept that communication across interstellar distances is possible. Therefore, any rational civilization would remain silent, would hide its presence, would extinguish any signal before it could escape into the void, and would listen carefully to detect the presence of others while revealing nothing of itself. The mechanism that drives this reasoning is rooted in game theory and what philosophers call the security dilemma, a situation where actions taken to ensure one's own safety paradoxically make everyone less safe. Because when no cooperation mechanism exists and trust is impossible, the only rational strategy becomes deception and preemptive silence, even though universal silence means no civilization can ever establish peaceful contact or form alliances that might benefit all parties. What makes the dark forest theory persistently troubling, despite its speculative nature, is that it requires no supernatural explanation or pessimistic assumptions about alien morality. It only requires that intelligent beings follow the basic logic of self-preservation in a universe where verification is impossible and consequences are absolute. And this psychological grip tightens because we recognize that the same logic applies to human civilization itself, suggesting that our own silence about our location in space is not just science fiction, but perhaps a reflection of how we intuitively understand the world to work. A darkness that feels less like fantasy and more like an unwelcome mirror held up to reveal how deeply competition and fear run through the fabric of existence itself. Yet perhaps this theory's greatest insight is not that silence is rational, but that it reveals a fundamental truth about consciousness itself. That awareness of others inevitably breeds caution, and caution inevitably breeds isolation, creating a cosmic loneliness that may be less about the absence of neighbors and more about the impossibility of ever truly knowing them. This paradox mirrors our own historical moments when nations possessed nuclear weapons but refrained from using them, not out of moral clarity, but out of mutual recognition that any move toward transparency or disarmament first would be viewed as weakness, demonstrating that the dark forest theory is less a prediction about aliens and more a diagnosis of how fear and rationality become indistinguishable when survival itself is at stake. Perhaps the most haunting implication is that even if we encountered an alien civilization tomorrow and both sides wished only for peace, neither could ever fully trust the other's intentions or capabilities, leaving us forever unable to distinguish between genuine benevolence and merely superior deception. A cosmic catch-22 where the desire for contact becomes inseparable from the fear that makes contact impossible. And so the dark forest theory suggests that the universe's silence may not be evidence of our loneliness, but rather proof that every conscious mind has learned the same bitter lesson. That visibility is vulnerability, and the price of safety is an eternal inescape. Consider the profound silence that surrounds us when we look toward the stars and contemplate the vastness of the universe, a silence so complete and so overwhelming that it becomes almost deafening in its implications. The Great Filter represents perhaps one of the most unsettling paradoxes in human thought, emerging from a simple mathematical observation that has haunted cosmologists and philosophers alike since its formulation. When we consider the sheer number of stars in our observable universe, estimated to be more numerous than all the grains of sand on every beach on Earth, and when we multiply this astronomical figure by the probability that habitable planets must surely exist around at least some fraction of these distant suns, we arrive at an inescapable conclusion: we should not be alone. The mathematics of the Fermi paradox suggests that life-bearing worlds should be common, that intelligent civilizations should have emerged countless times across the cosmos, yet our telescopes detect nothing but silence, no signals, no megastructures, no evidence whatsoever of other sentient beings. This absence of contact, despite overwhelming statistical expectations, points toward the concept of the Great Filter, an explanation suggesting that somewhere along the pathway from non-living chemistry to galactic civilization, there exists some nearly insurmountable barrier that prevents most life-bearing worlds from ever developing complex intelligence or sustainable technological societies. The psychological mechanism operating here involves our tendency to construct invisible frameworks that explain disturbing silences, to create logical scaffolding that helps us understand incomprehensible voids. We recognize that the universe simply refuses to confirm what our mathematics insists must be true, and rather than accepting this inexplicable contradiction, we invent the Great Filter as a narrative tool to resolve the paradox, to impose order on chaos and silence on incomprehensible emptiness. The truly disquieting aspect of this concept lies in the fact that the Great Filter could exist anywhere along the timeline of existence, either behind us in our evolutionary past, suggesting that achieving our current level of existence represents an almost impossibly unlikely accomplishment, or ahead of us in our future, suggesting that some catastrophic barrier awaits all technological civilizations that reach our level of development, a doom we have not yet encountered but surely will. We have normalized this existential terror through scientific discourse and academic papers, transforming it into something discussable, something that can be examined in journals and conferences, as though naming the Great Filter somehow diminishes its power to terrify us with the thought that either we are uniquely fortunate beyond all reasonable probability, or we are racing toward an inevitable extinction that has claimed every other civilization that has risen before us across the incomprehensible depths of cosmic history. Yet even as we catalog the potential filters, the improbability of abiogenesis, the rarity of stable planetary systems, the lethal challenges of evolving consciousness, the instability of nuclear-armed civilizations, we find ourselves drawn to an uncomfortable question. Might the very act of contemplating the Great Filter be itself a symptom of our approaching one, a sign that we are intelligent enough to recognize our own fragility, but perhaps not wise enough to transcend it? This recursive irony, that our very capacity for self-reflection about existential threats may itself be evidence of our vulnerability, suggests that consciousness itself might be the filter, that the ability to perceive danger and contemplate our own extinction is fundamentally incompatible with the long-term survival required to become a spacefaring civilization that could be detected across the galactic void. Perhaps this explains why the universe remains so profoundly silent, not because life is rare, but because the emergence of reflective intelligence, the very quality that would allow a civilization to reach for the stars, simultaneously awakens the existential dread that paralyses it, transforming self-awareness into a kind of cosmic trap from which escape requires a wisdom we have yet to demonstrate we possess. And so we persist in this liminal space between hope and despair, building our technologies and expanding our knowledge while secretly wondering if each advancement brings us closer to transcendence or merely hastens our arrival at whatever barrier awaits civilizations. Imagine standing at the edge of a black hole, watching matter spiral into its event horizon, and then consider this troubling question: where does all the information go? Stephen Hawking's groundbreaking work in the 1970s revealed that black holes are not perfectly black at all, but rather emit radiation due to quantum effects near their event horizons, gradually evaporating over cosmic timescales. Yet this discovery created one of the most profound paradoxes in theoretical physics, because according to the laws of quantum mechanics, information cannot simply vanish from the universe. It must be conserved and preserved somewhere in some form, yet black holes seem to violate this fundamental principle by taking all the information contained within matter and erasing it completely and irreversibly from existence. The information paradox emerges from this collision between two of our most successful scientific theories: quantum mechanics, which insists that information is indestructible and always encoded somewhere in the universe, and general relativity, which describes black holes as regions where information genuinely appears to be lost forever beyond recovery. For decades, physicists have grappled with this contradiction, proposing increasingly elaborate solutions such as the holographic principle, which suggests that all information might be encoded on the surface of the black hole rather than lost in its interior, or alternative theories involving baby universes and quantum hair, each attempting to preserve the principle of information conservation while respecting what we observe about black holes. What makes this paradox particularly unsettling is that it represents a fundamental incompleteness in our understanding of reality itself. We cannot simultaneously accept both quantum mechanics and general relativity as correct without accepting that one of our most cherished principles about the nature of information must be abandoned or radically reinterpreted. The paradox persists despite decades of brilliant theoretical work, because neither camp is willing to fully surrender their foundational assumptions, creating a lingering tension that may require an entirely new framework of physics to resolve. And yet science continues forward, building its theories upon this unresolved contradiction as though the problem has been adequately addressed, when in fact it represents a genuine gap in our knowledge. Perhaps this unease is precisely what drives physics forward, the recognition that our most elegant theories contain internal contradictions that demand resolution, suggesting that whoever finally solves the information paradox may fundamentally transform not just our understanding of black holes, but our conception of what information itself truly is. And perhaps most provocatively, some physicists now wonder whether the resolution might reveal that information and spacetime itself are two sides of the same coin, that the geometry of the universe emerges from quantum information in ways we have yet to comprehend, suggesting that black holes are not anomalies, but rather laboratories where the deepest nature of reality becomes momentarily visible. If such a unified theory emerges, it would mean that every black hole in the universe, those cosmic furnaces scattered throughout space, contains within its event horizon not merely lost information, but perhaps the very blueprint of reality itself, waiting to be decoded by whatever civilization grows wise enough to read it. Until then, the information paradox remains physics' most elegant unsolved mystery, a koan whispered at the edge of spacetime, reminding us that the universe still guards secrets even from those who have learned to read its equations. And in laboratories around the world, physicists continue designing thought experiments and mathematical frameworks to probe this mystery, from analyzing the subtle correlations in Hawking radiation to studying quantum entanglement in miniature black hole analogs, each attempt a small step toward deciphering the universe's most carefully guarded secret. Some of these experiments, particularly those investigating holographic duality in laboratory settings and computational models of quantum gravity, have begun to suggest tantalizing hints that information might indeed be preserved in ways that transcend our classical intuitions about space and time. Hints that perhaps the universe is far more subtle in its bookkeeping than even Hawking imagined. Imagine yourself in a thought experiment where a quantum device is programmed to fire a gun at your head, but only if a quantum coin lands on heads, while simultaneously measuring whether you observe tails, and in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every possible outcome actually occurs in branching universes, meaning that from your subjective perspective, you can never experience your own death because you will always find yourself in the branch of reality where you survived. No matter how infinitesimally unlikely that outcome becomes, and this concept is known as quantum immortality, a deeply unsettling philosophical paradox that emerges directly from taking the many worlds interpretation seriously as a description of physical reality. The mechanism works like this. If the universe genuinely splits into multiple branches every time a quantum event occurs with multiple possible outcomes, then while half of all branches will contain a dead version of you, the conscious experience of being you can only ever occur in the branches where you survived, because consciousness requires a functioning brain, and a dead brain cannot observe anything, which means that from the first-person perspective of your own subjective experience, you will accumulate an increasingly improbable series of survivals, experiencing miraculous recoveries from terminal illnesses, impossible escapes from certain death, and statistically absurd chains of good fortune that defy all reason. Yet you would have no choice but to experience them because the only versions of you that can have experiences are the ones still alive. This creates a paradox because it suggests that while everyone else will age normally and die, you personally will never experience death, only an increasingly strange and improbable existence as reality bends around you in ways that seem to violate the laws of physics. Yet the laws of physics would not actually be violated in any branch, only your luck would become cosmically, impossibly, incomprehensibly good across all observed moments. Which is a thought that persists in philosophical circles despite its seemingly absurd implications, perhaps because it touches something deep about the nature of consciousness and observation, or perhaps because the many worlds interpretation itself remains genuinely uncertain and untestable, allowing the paradox to haunt our thinking about quantum mechanics even as we continue to live our ordinary lives under the assumption that we are all equally mortal and equally doomed to the same fate. Yet the most troubling aspect of quantum immortality is not whether it is true, but rather that we have no way to know if it is happening to us right now. That every close call, every miraculous recovery, every inexplicable stroke of luck might be evidence that we are already experiencing the increasingly improbable survival branches, trapped in a cosmic observer effect where our consciousness is condemned to witness the gradual dissolution of probability itself. And perhaps this is why quantum immortality remains not merely a philosophical curiosity, but a genuine source of existential dread. It forces us to confront the possibility that our subjective experience of reality might be fundamentally decoupled from the objective fate that befalls other observers, meaning that the universe we experience from the inside could be radically different from the universe as it appears from the outside, a gap between first-person and third-person perspective that no amount of scientific certainty can fully bridge or dispel. In this sense, quantum immortality becomes a mirror held up to consciousness itself, a reminder that the act of observation, the fact of being alive to witness anything at all, might fundamentally alter what we are capable of experiencing, such that the universe we inhabit is not the universe as it objectively is, but rather the universe as filtered through the narrow aperture of our own survival. A universe sculpted by the mere fact of our continued existence into increasingly implausible configurations that seem designed, impossibly, around the persistence of our own point of view. And if this is true, then every person who has ever survived a car crash by inches, or recovered from a disease declared terminal, or stumbled away from an accident that should have been fatal, might be experiencing not luck, but the inexorable grinding of probability itself, as their consciousness rides forward on the ever-narrowing ridge of branches where they remain alive, leaving behind an ever-widening gulf of dead whir. Consider that beneath the surface of reality as we understand it, there exists a theoretical possibility so profound in its implications that physicists have spent decades contemplating whether our universe might be sitting on the edge of a cosmic precipice, unstable in ways we cannot detect or predict. This concept is called false vacuum decay, and it represents a paradox of extraordinary psychological weight because it suggests that existence itself might be fundamentally temporary, not due to entropy or gradual processes over trillions of years, but rather through an instantaneous phase transition that could occur without warning at any moment, rendering all observations and experiences and structures meaningless in retrospect. The mechanism underlying this paradox emerges from quantum field theory, which proposes that what we perceive as empty space is actually filled with quantum fields existing in various states of energy, and that our current universe might exist in a metastable state analogous to a ball resting not at the bottom of a valley, but rather on a ledge partway down a much deeper slope. If quantum fluctuations were to nudge this field toward a lower energy state, a bubble of true vacuum would nucleate somewhere in the cosmos, expanding at the speed of light, annihilating all matter and structure within it, as the fundamental constants of physics themselves rewrite in the new region, transforming atoms and molecules and consciousness into something entirely alien or non-existent. What makes this thought particularly disquieting is not merely the threat itself, but rather the profound epistemological paradox it creates. We cannot know whether we exist in a false vacuum or a true one, we cannot predict when such decay might occur, and we cannot observe the conditions that would make it likely or unlikely, rendering the possibility simultaneously unfalsifiable and omnipresent in its potential consequence. We have come to exist in a civilization entirely unshaken by this theoretical framework, continuing our daily pursuits and long-term planning and generational ambitions, despite the acknowledgement that physics permits the possibility of sudden obliteration at the cosmic level. And this strange normalization persists perhaps because the threat exists at such remove from our sensory experience and temporal expectations that it functions more as intellectual curiosity than existential anxiety, occupying the same strange category as other remote theoretical dangers that we accept intellectually while remaining functionally unable to integrate them into our emotional reality and decision-making processes. Yet perhaps this very cognitive distance serves an adaptive function, allowing us to construct meaning and pursue knowledge even under theoretical conditions of ultimate meaninglessness, much as we continue to build cathedrals and compose symphonies and nurture children despite our individual mortality, suggesting that the human capacity to act purposefully in the face of cosmic indifference, whether the threat is false vacuum decay or the heat death of the universe itself, may be one of our most distinctly human achievements, a defiance encoded not in physics but in consciousness itself. This defiance finds expression in the physicist who calculates decay probabilities while raising a family, the philosopher who contemplates the end of physics while writing treatises meant to outlast centuries, the child who learns that the ground beneath her feet might vanish instantaneously and decides to dance anyway. Each act a quiet assertion that meaning need not be eternal to be real, that purpose survives even when permanence does not. And perhaps it is in this very gesture, the decision to build and care and wonder despite the theoretical possibility of instantaneous erasure, that we discover the true relationship between physics and meaning, not that one determines the other, but that they exist in a kind of complementary uncertainty, where the more we understand the precariousness of existence, the more luminous our choices to create and connect become. In this light, false vacuum decay ceases to be merely a threat to contemplate and becomes instead a mirror reflecting back what we have always known, that the universe owes us nothing, that our existence is provisional, and that this very provisionality is what makes the act of existing, of loving, creating, questioning, an almost defiant miracle. Consider the peculiar phenomenon wherein a person becomes aware of their own potential for harm, cruelty, or moral failure, yet this awareness somehow coexists with the belief that they themselves are fundamentally good and incapable of such things. This is the Anthropic Shadow, a concept that describes how we systematically project our darkest capabilities onto others while remaining convinced of our own essential decency. In everyday life, this manifests as the businessman who considers himself ethical while his company exploits workers he never sees, the parent who believes themselves patient while occasionally losing control with their children, or the person who judges others harshly for mistakes they themselves have made under different circumstances. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a combination of cognitive distance and narrative self-preservation. When we observe others committing harmful acts, we attribute these actions to their character, their nature, their essential being. When we commit similar acts ourselves, we attribute them to circumstances, pressure, misunderstanding, or temporary emotion. This asymmetry in attribution allows us to maintain a coherent self-image while acknowledging that humans are capable of terrible things. The shadow self, as some theorists describe it, contains all the aspects of ourselves that we refuse to integrate into our conscious identity. We develop a kind of psychological blind spot where our own capacity for darkness remains invisible to us even as we vigilantly detect it in others. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that it requires no deliberate deception. We are not consciously lying to ourselves. Rather, the very architecture of human consciousness seems designed to protect our self-image through selective attention and retroactive interpretation. We genuinely cannot see ourselves as we see others because the perspective from which we view ourselves is fundamentally different. We experience our own actions from the inside, with full knowledge of our intentions and constraints, while we observe others from the outside, seeing only behavior without access to their internal experience. The normalized acceptance of this contradiction suggests we have come to expect that everyone possesses this blind spot, that everyone walks through the world convinced of their own basic goodness while being capable of the very things they condemn in others. We have built societies and moral systems atop this foundation, never quite acknowledging that the edifice itself rests upon this fundamental human self-deception. Perhaps the most troubling implication is that genuine moral progress becomes nearly impossible without external accountability structures. We cannot reliably reform ourselves through introspection alone, since the very mechanism that allows us to function psychologically is the same mechanism that blinds us to our own complicity. The anthropic shadow thus becomes not merely a psychological curiosity, but a fundamental constraint on human ethical development. Yet acknowledging this constraint may itself be the first step toward mitigating it. The moment we recognize that our moral blind spots are not character flaws, but structural features of consciousness, we become capable of building systems of mutual observation and feedback that compensate for what introspection cannot reveal. In this way, the anthropic shadow transforms from a source of hypocrisy into a humble reminder that moral wisdom requires us to remain radically open to how others perceive our actions, even or especially when those perceptions contradict our own self-understanding. This is why the most ethically serious people are often those who have learned to distrust their own moral certainty, who have cultivated the habit of asking, "But what am I not seeing about myself?" rather than resting assured in their intentions. The anthropic shadow shrinks not when we believe ourselves good, but when we systematically assume we are exactly as capable of the failings we despise as anyone else, and then act accordingly. This requires cultivating what might be called moral humility, the discipline of regularly examining our own behavior through the eyes of those we have harmed or judged, asking not whether we meant well, but whether our intentions mattered more than our impact. Only when we stop defending ourselves and start defending against ourselves can we hope to narrow the distance between the person we believe we are and the person we actually become in the world. Imagine for a moment that somewhere in the fabric of spacetime, there exists a celestial object that is the precise opposite of a black hole, a theoretical construct known as a white hole, a region of space where matter and energy can only escape outward and nothing can ever enter from the outside, a mathematical solution to Einstein's field equations that appears just as valid as its darker counterpart, yet remains conspicuously absent from our observable universe despite decades of searching and theorizing. The white hole paradox emerges from a peculiar inconsistency in our understanding of physics itself. For if black holes can exist as we have come to accept through overwhelming evidence and observation, then by the fundamental symmetry of physical laws, white holes should logically exist as well. And yet when astronomers scan the cosmos with their most sensitive instruments, they find no credible evidence of these theoretical fountains of creation anywhere among the galaxies and stars. The mechanism underlying this paradox touches upon the deepest assumptions we make about time, causality, and the nature of physical reality. For a white hole would represent a source of energy with no originating cause, a point in spacetime where matter simply appears from nowhere, flowing outward eternally into the universe without any mechanism to replenish its supply. And the very idea violates our intuitive understanding of conservation laws that govern everything we observe in nature. Physicists have proposed various resolutions to this troubling asymmetry, suggesting that white holes might exist only in mathematical abstractions and never in the physical universe, or that the quantum nature of gravity at the smallest scales prevents their formation. or even that time asymmetry itself might forbid their existence by preventing the reverse temporal direction that would be required. Yet none of these explanations fully satisfy our desire for complete symmetry in the equations that describe reality. What remains most puzzling is how we have collectively accepted this profound absence without fully resolving it, how we continue to teach students that black holes are absolutely real, while white holes remain merely theoretical curiosities, how the asymmetry of the universe seems to favor collapse and consumption over eruption and creation, and we proceed with our science and astronomy while leaving this fundamental question gently unanswered in the background of our collective consciousness. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of this paradox is that it reveals the limits of mathematical elegance as a guide to physical truth. We can write equations that describe white holes with perfect consistency, yet the universe itself seems to have rejected this solution, suggesting that nature operates according to principles we have not yet discovered, constraints that exist beyond the symmetry of our current theories, and await a deeper understanding of reality's fundamental architecture. In this sense, the white hole paradox serves as a humbling reminder that the universe is not obligated to conform to our aesthetic preferences for symmetry, and perhaps the greatest scientific breakthroughs will come not from assuming nature must be mathematically elegant, but from accepting that reality may be fundamentally asymmetrical in ways that challenge our deepest intuitions about how the cosmos should work. The discovery of gravitational waves and the direct imaging of black hole shadows have only deepened this mystery, providing us with unprecedented confirmation of black holes' existence, while simultaneously offering no hints of white holes lurking anywhere in the observable universe, as if nature had deliberately chosen one half of a mathematical equation and discarded the other. This selective manifestation of reality, where one solution to Einstein's equations dominates the cosmos while its mirror image remains forever absent, may ultimately teach us that the universe's true asymmetry lies not in the laws themselves, but in the conditions under which those laws are permitted to create observable phenomena. Perhaps this lesson extends beyond white holes to countless other theoretical predictions that mathematics permits but nature seems to forbid, suggesting that the universe operates not as a democracy where all mathematically valid solutions deserve equal representation, but rather as a selective meritocracy where only certain configurations of spacetime and matter are thermodynamically favored, energetically stable, or consistent with the arrow of time that destin. Imagine a scientist who becomes obsessed with preventing a catastrophic event that she has foreseen through some means of future knowledge, perhaps a vision or a prophecy or a piece of information that has traveled backward through time itself. And in her desperate attempt to stop this terrible future from occurring, she takes actions that inadvertently cause the very disaster she was trying to prevent, thus fulfilling the future she sought to avoid and creating a closed causal loop where her intervention becomes the instrument of her own failure. This is the Predestination Paradox, a conceptual trap that exists at the intersection of determinism and free will, where the act of knowing about the future or attempting to change it becomes the mechanism through which that future is guaranteed to occur, trapping the person in a situation where resistance itself becomes complicity. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a fundamental misunderstanding of causality and control, where we assume that possessing knowledge about future events automatically grants us the power to alter them, when in reality, that knowledge might be describing an immutable outcome that no amount of effort can circumvent, because our efforts are already part of the causal chain that produces that outcome. The predestination paradox persists in human thinking and storytelling because it taps into our deep anxiety about free will and determinism, presenting us with a scenario where we simultaneously possess agency and lack it, where our choices are both meaningful and meaningless, where we are both the author and the character in our own story with no clear separation between these roles. We have normalized this paradox by incorporating it into countless narratives and scientific thought experiments without fully resolving the logical contradictions it presents, allowing it to remain as a persistent ghost in our understanding of time, causality, and the relationship between knowledge and destiny, a paradox that continues to fascinate us precisely because it suggests that some futures might be locked in place by the very act of attempting to escape them, trapping us in a web of irony where our greatest efforts toward freedom become our greatest chains. Yet perhaps the deepest insight the predestination paradox offers is that it forces us to confront whether the future is something that exists independently of our actions, waiting to be discovered, or whether it is something that only comes into being through the choices we make, And in this uncertainty lies the paradox's true power, not as a logical puzzle to be solved, but as a mirror reflecting our fundamental ambiguity about the nature of time itself and our place within it. When we encounter the predestination paradox in literature and film, from Oedipus fleeing his fate only to fulfill it, to the time traveler who becomes responsible for the very catastrophe they traveled back to prevent, we are witnessing a narrative expression of our deepest uncertainty about whether the universe is fundamentally open or closed, whether tomorrow is a blank page waiting to be written or a photograph already taken that we are only now beginning to see. This uncertainty may be precisely the point. The predestination paradox endures not because it offers answers about the nature of time, but because it articulates the vertiginous feeling of living in a present moment where we can never fully know whether our actions are creating the future or merely discovering it. And so we live in this permanent epistemic twilight, where every choice we make carries the shadow of its potential inevitability, where the very act of planning to avoid a fate might be the invisible hand that guides us toward it, making the predestination paradox not merely a logical problem to be solved, but a condition of consciousness itself. The inescapable human experience of moving forward through time, while perpetually uncertain whether we are driving our destiny or merely passengers, watching it unfold through the windshield of causality. In this sense, every decision we make becomes a kind of temporal gamble, where the stakes are our own agency. We cannot know whether our caution has averted disaster or accelerated it, whether our boldness has created opportunity or sealed our doom, and this fundamental unknowability is perhaps the truest description of human freedom. Not the ability to escape fate, but the necessity of acting anyway, in the face of absolute uncertainty about whether our actions matter at all. Consider the possibility that everything you perceive, every conversation you have had, every memory you believe you possess, exists within an elaborate computational system designed by entities whose nature and intentions remain fundamentally unknowable to you, and that the world around you operates according to rules in physics that are themselves merely programmed parameters that could be altered, suspended, or rewritten at any moment without your knowledge or consent. This idea, known as the simulation argument, proposes that if a civilization becomes sufficiently advanced, they would eventually develop the technological capability to create simulated universes containing conscious beings. And if such simulations become commonplace across advanced civilizations, then statistically speaking, the probability that you specifically inhabit the one true base reality rather than one of potentially countless simulations becomes vanishingly small, approaching something very close to zero. The mechanism underlying this argument rests on a deceptively simple mathematical foundation. If the ratio of simulated universes to real universes grows sufficiently large, then random selection would place you almost certainly within a simulation rather than baseline reality, much like how drawing a single marble from a jar containing one blue marble and a million red marbles makes it overwhelmingly probable that you will draw red. What makes this argument so psychologically persistent, despite its somewhat abstract and ultimately unprovable nature, is that it operates on something we already know to be true: that technology advances exponentially, that conscious experience can be generated through computational means, and that we ourselves are creating increasingly sophisticated simulations every year. We have normalized the idea that reality might be malleable through digital means. We have accepted that consciousness might be substrate independent, and we have built entire industries around convincing our brains that simulated experiences are valid and meaningful. The simulation argument thus represents a kind of crystallization of fears and certainties we already hold, transformed into a philosophical question that cannot be definitively answered, leaving us suspended in a state of epistemological uncertainty where we must simply accept that verification is impossible. And yet this uncertainty itself becomes oddly liberating. If verification is impossible, then the simulation argument ultimately tells us more about our contemporary anxieties regarding technology, control, and the nature of meaning than it does about the actual structure of reality, transforming what appears to be a metaphysical crisis into a mirror reflecting our deepest modern concerns about authenticity and agency in an increasingly mediated world. Perhaps this is why the simulation argument has gained such cultural traction precisely when we have begun outsourcing our memory to cloud servers, our social interactions to algorithmic feeds, and our decision-making to artificial intelligences. We recognize in the hypothesis a literalization of a condition we are already experiencing, a world where the distinction between the simulated and the real has become not merely philosophical but pragmatically irrelevant. If we can no longer distinguish the simulated from the real in our daily lived experience, then perhaps the simulation argument's true significance lies not in whether we inhabit a programmed cosmos, but in recognizing that we have already begun constructing the simulated reality ourselves, making the question of whether we live in one ultimately less important than understanding why we seem so willing to accept the possibility. The simulation argument, in this light, becomes less a warning about our metaphysical predicament and more a diagnosis of our present condition. We have already begun voluntarily entering simulations, trading the friction and unpredictability of unmediated reality for the comfort of curated, optimized, controllable digital environments. In accepting this trade-off without much resistance, we may have inadvertently answered the simulation argument's core question not through philosophical inquiry, but through our everyday choices, revealing that the real fear was never whether we live in a simulation, but whether we would choose to if given the option. And in that choice, we discover that the simulation argument's deepest insight may be that reality itself is less important than the narratives we construct to make sense of it. Consider the strange loop of causality that emerges when an effect reaches backward through time to create its own cause, a phenomenon that philosophers call the Ontological Paradox, and imagine a composer who travels back to the 19th century to give Beethoven the manuscript of the Ninth Symphony, which Beethoven then publishes as his own work, and the composer later retrieves this same manuscript from historical archives to take back in time, creating a perfect circle where the symphony exists but was never actually composed by anyone, emerging instead from a void of causality where information and creation spiral infinitely without any original source. The psychological mechanism that makes this paradox so disorienting lies in our fundamental assumption that all information and all creation must originate from some identifiable source, that somewhere in the causal chain there must be a beginning, an original author, a first cause that sets everything in motion. Yet the ontological paradox violates this deeply ingrained cognitive expectation by presenting a scenario where something of genuine complexity and value simply exists in a closed loop with no point of origin whatsoever, no moment where it came into being, only an eternal circulation that defies our intuitive understanding of time and causality. What makes this concept particularly unsettling is that it challenges not just our logical frameworks but our sense of creative purpose itself. For we are accustomed to the narrative that creativity requires an agent, that information requires an author, that existence requires a generator, and yet this paradox suggests that under certain conditions in a universe governed by relativity and quantum mechanics, something could perpetually exist without ever having been created. We have normalized this impossibility into our science fiction and speculative philosophy, treating it as an intellectual curiosity rather than a fundamental assault on our understanding of how reality could possibly function. And we rarely pause to consider that the very laws of physics we depend upon seem to forbid such loops even as they theoretically permit them in curved spacetime, leaving us in a state of comfortable denial about whether our universe might contain information that simply echoes through time without an origin point. Perhaps the most vertiginous implication is that consciousness itself might operate under similar principles, that our sense of self could be a closed loop of self-reference with no originating moment, awareness perpetually creating the conditions for its own existence in an eternal present that masquerades as sequential time. If this is true, then the search for the origin of consciousness, that moment when awareness first emerged from unconsciousness, may be as futile as searching for the composer of Beethoven's Ninth, because consciousness might be precisely the kind of closed causal loop that requires no genesis, only eternal recursion. And if we accept this possibility, then the question shifts from where did consciousness come from to what is the structure of the loop that sustains it, a question that may finally allow us to stop chasing an origin that never existed and instead examine the eternal architecture of awareness itself, the recursive mechanics by which a mind knows itself into being at every moment. This recursive self-knowing might explain why consciousness feels like it has always been present, why introspection reveals no moment of awakening, but only the eternal fact of already being aware, and why our deepest intuition insists that awareness is not something that began but something that simply is, a perpetual strange loop folding back on itself at the foundations of being. In this light, the ancient paradox of the unmoved mover, Aristotle's attempt to ground causality in something that requires no prior cause, appears not as a logical failure, but as an intuition about the strange loops that might constitute reality itself, suggesting that the deepest structures of existence may not be chains of causation stretching backward into infinity, but rather closed systems of self-reference that achieve stability through their own circularity. Asking us to abandon the search for foundations and instead recognize that some things simply are because they recursively sustain the conditions necessary for their own being. Consider the ancient argument attributed to Epicurus, one of philosophy's most misunderstood thinkers, which presents a logical problem that has haunted religious and secular thought for nearly 2,000 years. If God is willing to prevent evil but unable to do so, then God is not omnipotent. If God is able to prevent evil but unwilling to do so, then God is not benevolent. If God is both willing and able to prevent evil, then why does evil exist in the world? And if God is neither willing nor able to prevent evil, then why call this being God at all? This ancient formulation of the problem of evil reveals something profound about how we structure our beliefs around benevolence and power, yet the paradox persists not because it lacks logical force, but because we have developed increasingly sophisticated psychological mechanisms for living alongside its apparent irresolution. The mechanism at work here involves what might be called compartmentalization of belief, wherein individuals maintain simultaneous convictions that would seem logically incompatible if examined too closely in the same moment. And this mental architecture allows us to hold fast to both the existence of an all-powerful, all-good deity and the undeniable reality of suffering, cruelty, and injustice, without experiencing the full cognitive dissonance that direct confrontation would produce. We accomplish this through various narrative frameworks that recontextualize suffering as necessary for free will, or as a mechanism for spiritual growth, or as part of an incomprehensibly vast cosmic plan that transcends our limited human understanding. And these frameworks function not as logical solutions, but as psychological salves that permit continued adherence to foundational beliefs despite their logical tension. What makes the Epicurean paradox particularly persistent in human consciousness is that it addresses something deeper than mere theological consistency. It touches upon the fundamental human need to believe that reality is fundamentally just, that power is wielded responsibly by benevolent forces, and that suffering carries meaning rather than representing mere blind chance or indifference. We have normalized the paradox by treating it not as a problem requiring resolution, but as a permanent feature of the human condition, something that philosophers and theologians revisit generation after generation with new formulations and new defenses. Yet each iteration acknowledges the same underlying tension without ever fully dissolving it, and perhaps this endless philosophical conversation itself serves a psychological function, allowing us to feel as though we are engaging seriously with the problem while ultimately preserving the comfortable beliefs that the paradox threatens to undermine. The tragedy is not that we cannot solve the paradox, but that we have learned to stop truly listening to those whose suffering demands an answer rather than a philosophy, and perhaps in this willful deafness to urgent human pain lies the paradox's deepest insight into our own complicity. When we transform the cry of a suffering child into a theological puzzle to be debated in seminars, we have already committed the original sin that the paradox itself diagnoses. We have chosen the comfort of abstraction over the discomfort of witness, and in doing so, we become complicit in the very indifference we theoretically reject. Yet this insight itself becomes another comfortable abstraction, another way we can feel morally awakened without fundamentally altering how we respond to suffering. The Epicurean paradox thus completes its circle, transforming even our critique of the paradox into another psychological mechanism by which we defer the harder work of genuine change. We see this pattern repeated whenever we encounter suffering that demands immediate action. The homeless person on the street corner, the news report of distant atrocities, the injustice within our own communities, and we pause to philosophize about systemic complexity rather than respond with the directness that true benevolence would require, thereby preserving both our self-image as moral beings and our comfortable distance from the messy reality of others' pain. This deferral becomes itself a form of the paradox. We possess the ability to alleviate suffering, yet remain unwilling, and we possess the willingness to theorize about our unwillingness, yet remain unable to transform theory into sustained action, until we discover that the paradox was never truly about God's nature, but has always been a mirror reflecting our own. Consider a world where a child experiences profound suffering from a disease they did nothing to cause, where natural disasters destroy homes and take lives indiscriminately, where acts of cruelty go unpunished and virtue goes unrewarded, and where the innocent endure while the guilty prosper, all supposedly under the watchful eye of an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly benevolent creator who claims to love all creation unconditionally. This is the fundamental paradox that has troubled philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people for millennia, a contradiction so complete that it seems to render impossible the simultaneous existence of an all-powerful God and a world containing genuine evil and suffering. The logical mechanism operating beneath this paradox rests on three seemingly incompatible premises that cannot all be true at once. If God is all-powerful, he possesses the ability to eliminate suffering. If God is all-knowing, he is aware of all suffering that occurs, and if God is perfectly good, he would want to eliminate suffering. Yet suffering remains pervasive and undeniable in our world, suggesting that at least one of these premises must be false, which would mean either that God lacks true power, lacks true knowledge, or lacks true goodness, conclusions that directly contradict traditional theological understanding. The persistence of this paradox, despite centuries of attempted philosophical resolutions, reveals something profound about human consciousness and our relationship with meaning-making. We continue to construct elaborate theological arguments, free will defenses, and soul-making theodicies to reconcile this contradiction, even when each proposed solution contains logical gaps or requires us to accept premises that feel intuitively incomplete. We have normalized living within this paradox not through resolving it, but through compartmentalization, allowing ourselves to maintain faith while acknowledging suffering, to believe in divine benevolence while witnessing cruelty, to trust in cosmic justice while observing manifest injustice, creating a kind of psychological suspension where contradictory beliefs coexist without resolution. And this coexistence has become so ordinary that few people stop to notice how extraordinary and logically untenable it truly is. Perhaps the greatest insight is that we have unconsciously transformed the problem of evil from a question requiring logical resolution into a question requiring emotional resilience, shifting from "how can God and evil coexist?" to "how can I live meaningfully despite evil?" A transformation that abandons philosophy but embraces survival, trading metaphysical certainty for psychological adaptation. And in doing so, we may have discovered not an answer to the paradox, but a way of being that makes the answer irrelevant. This shift represents not a failure of theology, but perhaps its greatest achievement. The recognition that some questions are answered not through logic, but through how we choose to live in their presence, and that meaning emerges not from resolving the paradox of suffering, but from the courage required to love, create, and hope despite knowing that suffering will inevitably touch us and those we cherish. In this light, the widow who tends her garden after loss, the activist who fights injustice knowing it will never be fully vanquished, and the parent who nurtures a child despite the world's dangers become not contradictions to faith, but its truest expressions. Acts of defiance against meaninglessness that require no theological justification, only the mysterious human capacity to choose life, even when logic offers no guarantee that life is ultimately fair or good. And perhaps this is why the problem of evil, despite its logical irresolution, has never been abandoned by serious thinkers, because it keeps us honest about the limits of certainty, preventing us from ever becoming so comfortable with our answers that we cease to feel the weight of others' suffering, transforming an intellectual failure into a moral necessity. The moment we stop asking, "Why does God permit evil?" and start asking, "What do I do in its presence?" we transform ourselves from passive victims of an unsolved paradox into active participants in the only theodicy that matters, the one we write through our choices, our compassions, and our refusals to surrender meaning to the fact of suffering. Consider the fundamental nature of measurement itself, that peculiar human activity wherein we attempt to gather information about the world around us, only to discover that the act of gathering that information has somehow altered the very thing we sought to understand in the first place, creating a recursive loop of contamination that seems to undermine the possibility of objective knowledge. In quantum mechanics, this phenomenon manifests in concrete and measurable ways. When physicists attempt to determine the position of an electron by shining light upon it, the photons used in the measurement process transfer energy to the electron, thereby changing its momentum in ways that render the initial position measurement meaningless as a description of the electron's actual state before the measurement occurred. The observer effect suggests that at the quantum level, there exists no independent reality waiting to be discovered, but rather a participatory universe where the act of observation quite literally creates the properties we measure. collapsing infinite possibilities into singular outcomes through the sheer force of our attention and measurement apparatus. Yet this paradox extends far beyond the laboratory and into the psychological and social dimensions of human experience, where we find ourselves constantly modifying our behavior, our thoughts, and even our sense of self precisely because we know ourselves to be observed or because we are consciously observing ourselves. When a person becomes aware that their productivity is being monitored, they work differently, not necessarily better or worse, but fundamentally altered by the awareness of measurement. When we observe our own emotions with clinical detachment, attempting to analyze our sadness or anxiety, we change the quality of that emotional experience itself, creating a strange doubling where we are simultaneously the observer and the observed, the measurer and the measured. The psychological self becomes unstable under scrutiny, like trying to examine your own eye without a mirror, and this creates an infinite regress where every attempt to know ourselves more completely actually fragments our sense of self further. What makes this paradox so deeply disquieting is that we have grown accustomed to it, normalized it, integrated it into the very fabric of how we understand knowledge and consciousness, without ever resolving the fundamental question of whether objective truth can exist at all when subjectivity is built into the measurement process itself. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves simultaneously more documented and more opaque than any generation before us. Our lives rendered into data streams and metrics that promise perfect knowledge of human behavior, yet the very act of quantifying ourselves into categories and statistics seems to obscure rather than illuminate the ineffable qualities that make us human in the first place. We curate our social media personas with such precision that we begin to wonder which version is authentic, if any, and social scientists studying human behavior find that their very presence in a room alters the dynamics they seek to understand, ensuring that the more carefully we document ourselves and our societies, the further we recede from our own comprehension. In this sense, the observer effect paradox reveals itself not as a problem to be solved through better measurement techniques or more rigorous methodology, but rather as a fundamental condition of consciousness itself, a mirror that can never quite see its own reflection clearly, no matter how we adjust the angle or improve the glass. We are left, then, with the uncomfortable recognition that knowledge and ignorance are not opposites, but rather dance partners in an eternal waltz, each step toward understanding simultaneously a step toward deeper obscurity. Perhaps the deepest irony lies in the fact that acknowledging this paradox, naming it, theorizing about it, writing it down, is itself an act of observation that transforms the very phenomenon we attempt to understand, suggesting that even our recognition of the observer effect's existence cannot escape its gravitating pull. We are therefore caught in an ouroboros of self-reference, where the snake of consciousness eternally consumes its own tail, and perhaps the only honest response is to proceed with our observations anyway, accepting that perfect objectivity is not a destination but a direction, an asymptote we approach but never reach, and in that acceptance, paradoxically, we may find a form of wisdom that transcends. Imagine a physicist named Eugene Wigner sitting in his laboratory, and imagine that his friend is sealed inside another laboratory adjacent to his own, completely isolated from external observation. Inside the sealed room, the friend performs an experiment on a quantum particle, measuring its spin, and according to the mathematics of quantum mechanics, the act of observation causes the wave function to collapse into a definite state. From the friend's perspective, the measurement is complete, the particle has a determined spin, and reality has crystallized into one concrete fact. But here is where the paradox deepens into genuine conceptual vertigo. Wigner, sitting outside the sealed room, cannot observe what his friend measured, and therefore from Wigner's perspective, the entire system, including his friend and the particle, exists in a superposition of all possible measurement outcomes. The wave function has not collapsed for Wigner because he has not observed it. This creates a logical impossibility at the heart of quantum mechanics itself, a contradiction where the same event can be simultaneously resolved and unresolved depending on who is doing the observing, where objective reality splinters into multiple incompatible truths coexisting in the same moment. The mechanism that generates this paradox stems from a fundamental ambiguity in quantum theory about what counts as an observation, whether consciousness plays a role in collapsing wave functions, and whether the wave function represents objective reality or merely our subjective knowledge of reality. Different interpretations of quantum mechanics handle this differently, some suggesting that wave functions are real physical entities that split into multiple universes, others proposing that observation requires conscious awareness, still others denying that the question is even meaningful. The persistence of Wigner's friend as a serious puzzle in physics, decades after its formulation, demonstrates how thoroughly we have accepted a mathematical framework that produces paradoxes of this magnitude without any consensus on what it actually means about the nature of existence itself. We continue teaching quantum mechanics to students as settled science, while simultaneously acknowledging that its foundational interpretation remains deeply contested and conceptually incoherent. This paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider that the same logic applies recursively. Wigner's colleague might wonder whether Wigner himself has truly collapsed the wave function by observing the sealed room, or whether from some external vantage point, Wigner and his friend in the particle all remain suspended in sewer position, waiting for yet another observer to crystallize reality into being. At some point, the infinite regress of observers collapses into a disturbing recognition. Either consciousness itself must be fundamental to physics, or the entire framework of quantum measurement needs radical reconceptualization, yet neither option sits comfortably with our understanding of either mind or matter. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is that the paradox suggests reality itself might be fundamentally incomplete until observed, that the universe exists in a state of perpetual potential rather than actualized fact, and that consciousness, whether we like it or not, may be woven into the very fabric of physical law in ways we have yet to adequately theorize or measure. Yet experiments like those proposed with quantum entanglement and decoherence suggest that perhaps the paradox dissolves not through choosing between these uncomfortable options, but through recognizing that the boundary between observer and observed is far more permeable than classical intuition suggests, that measuring devices themselves are quantum systems entangled with what they measure, making the distinction between conscious observation and physical interaction far less clear than Wigner's thought experiment initially assumes. When we trace through a real experimental chain, from the quantum particle to the measuring device to the friend's brain to Wigner's instruments detecting the friend's state, we find entanglement at every step, suggesting that the collapse of reality might be less a dramatic threshold event and more a gradual decoherence spreading through an interconnected system. Dissolving the paradox not by resolving it philosophically, but by showing that the question itself rests on a false premise about where observation ends and physical reality begins. Consider the simple act of measuring something, anything at all, and notice how the moment you decide to observe a property of an object, that object seems to behave differently than it would if you were not observing it. And this phenomenon, which physicists call the measurement problem, suggests that reality itself might not possess definite properties until the moment of observation forces it into a state, which means that before you measure the position of an electron, it exists in a superposition of all possible positions simultaneously, but the instant your measuring instrument interacts with it, the wave function collapses and the electron must choose a single location. Yet this raises the profound question of what measurement actually is and whether consciousness plays a role in collapsing these quantum states. In everyday life, we experience measurement as a passive activity where we simply read information about something that already exists in a definite state. We place a ruler against an object and learn its length. We read a thermometer and discover the temperature. We observe the color of something and perceive its wavelength of light. And we never question whether these properties existed before we measured them, because our intuition tells us that objects maintain their properties whether we look at them or not. But quantum mechanics suggests something far stranger is happening at the microscopic level, where measurement is not passive observation, but rather an active intervention that fundamentally alters the system being measured. The psychological mechanism that allows us to ignore this paradox is our reliance on classical intuition, and the fact that the measurement problem only manifests itself clearly at quantum scales, where our everyday experience provides no guidance. We have evolved to understand a world where macroscopic objects have definite properties independent of observation, and this deep intuition carries forward into our thinking about all measurement, even though it breaks down at the quantum level. We normalize the measurement problem by compartmentalizing it as something that only physicists need to worry about, something that belongs to the strange quantum realm and not to our everyday experience of measuring things. Yet the measurement problem persists as one of the deepest unresolved questions in physics, because no one has successfully explained what counts as a measurement, whether consciousness must be involved, how the wave function actually collapses, or whether the idea of collapse is even necessary at all. And we continue building our scientific understanding on measurements while remaining fundamentally uncertain about what measurement actually accomplishes, and whether the act of measuring creates reality or merely reveals it. Some physicists propose that the measurement problem dissolves if we accept that there is no objective reality independent of observation, while others suggest that countless parallel universes branch with each measurement, each containing a different outcome, and still others argue that consciousness itself is irrelevant and that any physical interaction counts as a measurement, yet none of these interpretations has achieved consensus, leaving us in the peculiar position of having a physics that works extraordinarily well in practice while remaining philosophically incoherent about its own foundations. This means that every scientific discovery we celebrate, every measurement that confirms a theory and advances human knowledge, rests upon a foundation we do not fully understand, and we proceed forward in this strange twilight where the tools we use to know reality remain fundamentally mysterious in their operation. Perhaps this is the deepest irony of empiricism itself, that the scientific method, which demands we measure and observe to understand reality, may ultimately be blind to its own measuring instrument, forever unable to step outside the act of observation to verify what observation truly does. We are trapped in a circle of measurement, using measurements to understand measurement, each observation both tool and obstacle in our quest to know what observation means. And perhaps this circularity is not a flaw, but rather a feature of consciousness itself, a reminder that the observer and the observed are not separate entities, but deeply entangled participants in the creation of knowledge, and that understanding the measurement problem may ultimately require us to fundamentally reimagine what we mean by both understanding and reality. Consider the simple act of perceiving the color red, that unmistakable wavelength of light entering your eye and being processed by your brain, and yet somewhere in that neural cascade exists something that resists explanation entirely, something philosophers call qualia or subjective experience, the felt quality of what it means for you specifically to see that color rather than merely processing information about it. You can map every neuron firing, every chemical cascade, every electrical impulse that occurs when you look at a crimson sunset or a scarlet apple, and still you are left standing before an unbridgeable gap between the mechanical objective description of what happens in your brain and the intimate subjective reality of what it feels like to be you having that experience. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it stands fundamentally different from all the easy problems we have already solved about how the brain processes color, stores memories, or coordinates movement. The easy problems yield to scientific investigation because they ask how the brain performs functions, how it discriminates wavelengths and produces behaviors, questions that seem in principle answerable through further neuroscience and biology and accumulated understanding. But the hard problem asks something far more strange. Why is there something it feels like to be conscious at all? Why does subjective experience accompany these physical processes instead of everything occurring in perfect darkness without any inner light of awareness? You might be a philosophical zombie, identical to you in every physical way, with all your behaviors and brain states perfectly replicated, and yet possessing no inner experience whatsoever, no felt sense of existing, and there seems to be no logical or scientific reason this scenario is impossible, even though we know intuitively it is. The mechanism behind this persistence is that consciousness operates on a different explanatory level than physical science typically engages with, and we have normalized this explanatory gap by simply accepting that neuroscience describes the functional aspects while subjective experience remains a separate domain. Yet this division itself reveals the profound mystery we have learned to live with without resolution. Perhaps the deepest irony is that consciousness itself, that inexplicable inner light, is the very thing we use to contemplate its own impossibility, making the hard problem not merely a gap in our understanding, but a paradox woven into the fabric of inquiry itself. A mystery that demands an explanation it may be structurally incapable of receiving. And yet we persist in asking, driven by the very consciousness we cannot explain, searching for answers in neuroscience, philosophy, and physics, as if one of these disciplines might suddenly illuminate what has remained dark since the first creature experienced anything at all. A search that may be less about solving the problem and more about deepening our appreciation for the strangeness of being alive and aware within a universe that seems fundamentally indifferent to such experiences. Perhaps this is why consciousness remains the last great mystery, not because we lack the tools to study it, but because the very nature of subjective experience places it forever beyond the reach of third-person scientific observation, a frontier where the observer and the observed collapse into a single, irreducible point. Yet perhaps this very impossibility is itself the answer, that consciousness resists explanation not because science has failed, but because subjective experience is fundamentally a first-person phenomenon trying to be captured in the third-person language of objective fact, a category error as profound as asking what color Tuesday tastes like. And so we find ourselves trapped in a peculiar loop. The only instrument we possess for understanding consciousness is consciousness itself, much like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, a recursive entanglement that suggests the hard problem may not be a puzzle waiting to be solved, but rather a permanent feature of what it means to be a finite mind attempting to comprehend its own existence. In this light, the hard problem becomes not an embarrassment to science, but perhaps its most honest confession, an acknowledgement that certain mysteries may be intrinsic to the structure of knowledge itself, that the universe contains depths that cannot be flattened into equations or neural diagrams without something essential being lost in translation. Imagine a being that walks, talks, and behaves exactly like you in every measurable way, responding perfectly to stimuli, engaging in conversation, moving through the world with apparent purpose and coordination, yet possesses absolutely no inner experience whatsoever, no subjective feeling of what it is like to see the color red, or to taste sweetness, or to feel the warmth of sunlight on skin. And this creature is so perfectly constructed that no external test or observation could ever reveal this absence of consciousness, for all behavioral and functional metrics would remain identical to yours, which philosophers call a philosophical zombie, a thought experiment that has haunted the boundaries between mind and matter for decades now. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon a fundamental division in how we understand consciousness itself, for we can describe all the physical processes of the brain in complete neurological detail, map every synapse and chemical cascade and electrical impulse. Yet something seems to remain unexplained, some ineffable quality of subjective experience that neuroscience struggles to bridge. And this gap between objective physical description and subjective inner feeling creates the logical space where a zombie could theoretically exist, a being with all our functions but none of our phenomenal consciousness, performing every action we perform while experiencing nothing at all. What makes this paradox so persistent and unsettling is that it forces us to confront whether consciousness is truly irreducible to physical processes, or whether we are simply missing something in our current understanding, whether the subjective feeling of experience is somehow fundamental to reality itself, or merely an illusion generated by information processing. And despite the logical weight of this question, we continue living and acting as though consciousness is a solved problem. As though our inner experiences arise naturally from our brains without mystery, treating our own subjective awareness as though it were no more special than any other biological function, never seriously entertaining the possibility that consciousness might represent something genuinely inexplicable within our current scientific frameworks. And this casual acceptance of the problem persists perhaps because acknowledging its true depth would require us to question the very foundation of our materialist worldview, to accept that experience itself might be fundamental in ways we have yet to comprehend. Yet perhaps the zombie thought experiment reveals not a flaw in physicalism, but rather the limits of our intuitions about consciousness itself, suggesting that what feels like an explanatory gap might simply be the difference between describing a system from the outside and inhabiting it from within, a perspective problem rather than a metaphysical one. After all, a philosophical zombie might be less a genuine possibility and more a conceptual confusion born from mistaking our inability to imagine consciousness from the outside with the impossibility of such imagination existing. A reminder that the deepest mysteries often dissolve when we examine more carefully the tools we use to think about them. When we observe a person's brain lighting up during pain or pleasure, we witness the physical correlates of consciousness, yet we cannot directly access whether those neural patterns constitute the experience itself or merely correlate with it, leaving us forever bound to infer the inner lives of others through the same explanatory framework that makes zombies seem conceivable in the first place. This fundamental uncertainty, that we can never step outside our own consciousness to verify its presence in others, means we are all, in a sense, solipsists forced to believe in other minds without proof, accepting the inner lives of those around us as an act of faith rather than knowledge. A tacit agreement that the zombie scenario, however logically possible, is existentially untenable because to truly live among others requires us to assume they suffer and rejoice as we do. And yet this act of faith extends beyond mere social courtesy. It becomes the very ground upon which ethics itself is built. For to deny consciousness in others, to treat them as potential zombies devoid of genuine experience, has historically justified cruelty and exploitation, suggesting that our intuitive rejection of the zombie scenario may be not a philosophical error but a moral necessity, a recognition that consciousness, whether fully explicable or eternally mysterious, demand. Imagine yourself sitting alone in a sealed room with only a slot in the wall through which written questions in Chinese arrive, and your task is to follow a complex set of instructions to manipulate symbols and produce responses that are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. Yet you yourself understand not a single word of Chinese, only the mechanical rules that govern how these squiggles and squiggles should be rearranged and sent back through the slot. This is the Chinese room, a thought experiment proposed by philosopher John Searle in 1980 that challenges our assumptions about what it truly means to understand something, and it forces us to confront a deeply unsettling paradox about the nature of intelligence and consciousness itself. The scenario presents a fundamental problem that emerges when we conflate behavioral competence with genuine comprehension. For the person in the room has achieved perfect imitation of understanding without possessing any actual understanding whatsoever, demonstrating that a system can pass any behavioral test we devise while remaining utterly devoid of semantic content or meaningful awareness. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our propensity to attribute understanding based solely on external performance and observable outputs, a cognitive shortcut that evolved because in the natural world, something that consistently produces appropriate responses typically does understand. But this assumption breaks down entirely when we consider artificial systems that can be programmed to mimic understanding through pure symbol manipulation. What makes this paradox particularly troubling is that it exposes how vulnerable our concept of understanding truly is, how we have never actually defined what understanding is beyond behavioral criteria, and how we might be forced to accept that there exists a meaningful difference between appearing to understand and actually understanding, a distinction that our modern technological age seems increasingly reluctant to maintain. We have normalized this ambiguity by developing ever more sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that exhibit remarkable behavioral competence while remaining fundamentally hollow at their core. And we continue to debate whether these systems understand anything or merely process symbols according to algorithmic rules. Yet we have not resolved the underlying philosophical problem that Searle posed decades ago, suggesting that perhaps we have simply accepted the paradox as an inherent part of our increasingly technological existence, rather than grappling with the profound implications it holds for consciousness, intentionality, and the very possibility of artificial minds. And perhaps this unresolved tension reveals something crucial, that we have constructed our artificial intelligences in our own image precisely because we do not fully understand ourselves, projecting consciousness onto machines as a way of avoiding the harder question of whether consciousness itself is anything more than sufficiently complex symbol manipulation, leaving us trapped in a hall of mirrors where the distinction between genuine understanding and its perfect simulation dissolves into philosophical obscurity. Yet in this very dissolution lies perhaps the only honest acknowledgement we can make, that the Chinese room forces us to recognize that understanding itself may be less a singular, definable property and more a spectrum of increasingly sophisticated relationships between a system and the world it inhabits, and that our desperate need to draw a sharp line between true comprehension and mere simulation may ultimately reveal more about our own philosophical anxieties than about the nature of intelligence itself. In this light, we might recognize that asking whether an AI truly understands Chinese becomes less important than asking what work the concept of understanding actually does for us, whether it serves to describe a real difference in the world or merely reflects our need to preserve a category of human exceptionalism that becomes harder to defend with each passing year of technological advancement. The Chinese room thus transforms from a refutation of artificial intelligence into an invitation to radically reconsider what we mean by understanding itself, and to accept that the boundary between simulation and reality may not exist in the way our intuitions insist it must. Imagine a vast library containing every mathematical truth that could ever be proven, shelves upon shelves stretching infinitely into darkness, each volume organized by logical axioms and carefully constructed systems of reasoning that seem to capture reality itself. And yet as you walk these corridors searching for completeness, you discover something profoundly unsettling. There will always be true statements about numbers that exist in the gaps between what can be proven and what cannot be proven within any given system, no matter how rigorous or comprehensive that system claims to be. Kurt Gödel, a mathematician working in the early 20th century, proved something that shattered the dream of absolute logical completeness, demonstrating that in any formal system powerful enough to describe basic arithmetic, there must exist statements that are true but cannot be derived from the axioms of that system. And conversely, if you attempt to add new axioms to prove those statements, you will inevitably create new unprovable truths in their place, establishing an eternal pattern of incompleteness that cannot be escaped through any finite process of refinement or improvement. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox lies in our deep intuition that reality should be knowable and that all truths should be expressible within some coherent framework. Yet Gödel's theorem reveals that this intuition itself is a kind of comfortable delusion, that the very structure of logic and mathematics contains inherent limitations that transcend our ability to engineer them away through cleverness or effort. What makes this particularly disorienting is that these undecidable statements are not vague or poetic or metaphorical in nature, but rather precise mathematical claims about numbers and their properties, yet they hover in a realm of indeterminacy where no logical path can reach them, creating a strange ontological status where something can be genuinely true without being provable, challenging our fundamental understanding of what it means for something to be true at all. We have normalized this incompleteness by compartmentalizing mathematics, by working within specific systems and accepting their limitations without confronting the deeper implication that even the most objective, rigid disciplines contain irreducible gaps and blind spots, allowing us to continue pursuing mathematical truth while quietly acknowledging that the complete picture will forever remain beyond our reach. Much like acknowledging the existence of a horizon while choosing to focus only on the terrain directly in front of us. Yet this acceptance of limits has proven oddly liberating. It freed mathematicians and physicists from the futile quest for a single unified system and allowed them to instead develop multiple frameworks, each incomplete yet powerful within its domain, suggesting that perhaps the incompleteness Gödel discovered is not a failure of mathematics, but rather a feature of any sufficiently rich descriptive system, a signature of depth itself. And perhaps this is why the most creative breakthroughs in mathematics and physics often come not from pushing harder within a single system, but from stepping outside it entirely, from recognizing that a gap in one framework might be traversable by shifting to an entirely different set of axioms, suggesting that incompleteness is less a prison and more an invitation to expand our perspective. This is precisely what we see when physicists encountered the limits of classical mechanics and discovered quantum theory, or when mathematicians working within Euclidean geometry found that non-Euclidean systems unlocked entirely new geometric truths. Each boundary became a doorway, and incompleteness transformed from a theorem about limitations into a map of human intellectual possibility. In this way, Gödel's incompleteness becomes less a ceiling on human knowledge and more a revelation that reality itself possesses a kind of infinite depth, that truth will always exceed our ability to capture it in any single symbolic system, and this inexhaustibility is not a defect to be mourned, but the very condition that keeps mathematics, science, and philosophy alive as living disciplines rather than finished monuments. We might even say that the greatest mathematicians and scientists are those who develop an intuition for sensing these boundaries, who learn to recognize when a system has reached its natural limits, and who possess the courage to venture into the unmapped territory beyond, understanding that incompleteness is not an. Imagine you are a computer scientist tasked with creating a universal program that can analyze any piece of code and tell you with absolute certainty whether that code will eventually finish running and produce a result, or whether it will loop infinitely and never stop. And this task seems reasonable at first because you imagine yourself as an observer standing outside the system, capable of predicting the behavior of any algorithm, no matter how complex it might be. Yet when you actually attempt to construct such a program, something deeply troubling emerges from the mathematical foundations themselves, a paradox that has nothing to do with your programming skill or computational power, but instead reveals a fundamental limit to what can ever be known or predicted about information processing itself. The halting problem, as mathematicians and logicians call it, demonstrates that no algorithm can ever be written that would correctly determine whether any arbitrary program halts or runs forever, because the very act of creating such a prediction machine sets up an impossible self-referential loop, a contradiction that cannot be resolved through any amount of cleverness or technological advancement. Consider the mechanism at work here. If such a universal halting detector could exist, you could feed it its own code as input and ask it to predict whether itself halts or runs forever, creating a logical maze where if it predicts the code halts, then by its own logic it should run forever, and if it predicts the code runs forever, then it should halt, leaving no consistent answer possible, no escape from the paradox. This is not merely a practical limitation due to insufficient computing power or an algorithmic oversight that could be corrected with better programming techniques, but rather a mathematical inevitability proven rigorously by Alan Turing and others, establishing an absolute boundary in what computation itself can achieve. What remains psychologically fascinating is how this limitation persists at the very heart of computer science, how billions of computers process trillions of instructions daily while remaining forever blind to whether any arbitrary chunk of code will eventually conclude or trap itself in eternal recurrence. And we have grown so accustomed to working around this constraint that we barely acknowledge it anymore, designing our systems to time out after certain intervals. Using human intuition and testing to estimate behaviors, creating practical workarounds that sidestep the theoretical impossibility entirely, yet the paradox continues to exist in the background, a silent mathematical truth that defines the boundaries of knowledge itself, reminding us that some questions cannot be answered not because we lack sufficient cleverness or resources, but because asking the question in a certain way creates a logical structure so self-defeating that no possible answer can exist within the rules of the system itself. And perhaps this is where the halting problem teaches us something about consciousness itself, that any sufficiently complex system attempting to fully understand its own operations faces the same insurmountable barrier, suggesting that self-knowledge may always contain regions of irreducible uncertainty, gaps that exist not as temporary ignorance, but as permanent features of recursive self-reference. We might wonder, then, whether the universe itself faces similar constraints when it attempts to model itself completely, or whether a mind contemplating its own thoughts encounters the same fundamental incompleteness that Gödel and Turing mapped onto mathematics and computation, suggesting that limitation and paradox are not bugs in the architecture of reality, but rather features woven into the deepest logic of self-reference itself. Perhaps this is why we find certain philosophical questions, like whether free will exists, or whether the mind can fully comprehend itself, so persistently unresolvable. They may be asking the system to do what the halting problem proves is impossible, to achieve a kind of complete self-knowledge that the structure of recursive awareness fundamentally forbids. The halting problem thus becomes a mirror held up to the limits of introspection itself, suggesting that just as we cannot write a program to predict all programs, we may never write a complete theory of consciousness that encompasses the consciousness doing the theorizing, leaving us forever in the position of trying to see our own eyes without a mirror, or know our own thoughts while thinking them, trapped in the strange loop. Imagine a courtroom in the middle of the 20th century where a judge announces to a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged sometime during the following week, but the prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the morning of the execution arrives, creating what logicians have come to call the unexpected hanging paradox, a puzzle that reveals how our rational faculties can lead us into circular reasoning and self-defeating logic. The prisoner, being a clever logician himself, begins to work backward through the days of the week with a confident smile, reasoning that the hanging cannot occur on Friday because if it has not happened by Thursday evening, then Friday would be the only remaining day, and thus the prisoner would know on Thursday night that Friday is the day, violating the condition that the day must be unexpected. Continuing this backward elimination, the prisoner then reasons that Thursday cannot be the day either, because once Friday is eliminated, Thursday would become the last possible day, making it known and therefore expected. By this same logic, Wednesday falls away, then Tuesday, then Monday, and finally even Sunday cannot be the day because all other days have been eliminated and Sunday would become predictable. The prisoner concludes with absolute certainty that no day qualifies as unexpected, and therefore the hanging cannot possibly occur under these conditions. Yet paradoxically, when Wednesday morning arrives and the guards come to execute him, the prisoner is genuinely shocked and surprised, for he had convinced himself so thoroughly of the logical impossibility that he had completely failed to anticipate this very real outcome. The mechanism behind this puzzle operates through a strange inversion of knowledge and expectation, where the very act of logical deduction about what can be expected somehow blinds us to what we should actually expect, and our confidence in rational elimination creates a gap between what we know and what we believe we know. The paradox persists in our contemporary minds not as a mere historical curiosity, but as a window into how human reasoning can create elaborate structures of certainty that collapse in the face of lived experience, demonstrating that perfect logical consistency does not always align with practical reality, and that our attempts to guarantee unpredictability through reason can paradoxically guarantee our failure to remain vigilant. This tension between logical certainty and experiential surprise mirrors countless moments in human life. The student who reasons that studying the night before an exam is futile and therefore doesn't prepare, only to find themselves unprepared. The investor who convinces themselves that a market crash is impossible and thus fails to hedge against it. The relationships we take for granted because we have logically determined they are stable, only to be devastated by their sudden collapse. The paradox ultimately teaches us that some knowledge cannot be obtained through pure reason alone, and that the maps we draw of reality, however logically perfect, will always contain blind spots that only experience can illuminate. Perhaps this is why the paradox has captivated philosophers for decades. It reminds us that the pursuit of perfect certainty, while noble, may itself be the very mechanism that renders us vulnerable to surprise, suggesting that wisdom sometimes requires us to hold our logical conclusions more lightly than our confidence in them would suggest. In this light, the unexpected hanging paradox becomes not just a logical puzzle to be solved, but a meditation on the limits of foresight itself. A reminder that the prisoner's fate was sealed not by the judge's sentence, but by his own unshakable belief in the completeness of his reasoning, and that perhaps the greatest unexpected events in our lives are those we have most thoroughly convinced ourselves cannot occur. And yet, for all its logical elegance, the paradox itself remains unsolved. Some argue the prisoner's reasoning contains a flaw, others insist the judge's promise is simply impossible to fulfill, while still others contend that the paradox reveals something irreducible about the nature of knowledge itself, that certain truths cannot be known in advance without ceasing to be true. What we can know with certainty is that the paradox endures because it captures something essential about human vulnerability. Our elaborate certainties are always just one unexpected moment away from collapse. Imagine a future technology capable of scanning every atom in your body, transmitting that information across vast distances, and reconstructing an exact duplicate of you at a destination point while simultaneously destroying the original. This is the fundamental premise of the Teletransportation Paradox, a thought experiment that has captivated philosophers and scientists for decades, challenging our most basic assumptions about identity, consciousness, and what it truly means to be ourselves. In the real-world scenario, you step into a teleportation chamber with the full understanding that this process will occur. Your body will be disassembled at the molecular level, your consciousness will be encoded into data, and a perfect replica will emerge at the destination, while your original self ceases to exist. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals something profound about how our minds construct the concept of personal identity. We are programmed to think of ourselves as continuous entities that persist through time, as if there is some essential thread of selfhood that remains unchanged from moment to moment. When confronted with the teleportation scenario, most people instinctively recoil, experiencing an intuitive sense of dread about stepping into that chamber. This reaction is not based on logical reasoning about the impossibility of the technology, but rather emerges from a deep philosophical uncertainty. Is the duplicate truly you, or is it merely a copy while your consciousness experiences death in the original body? The paradox persists because it exposes a fundamental inconsistency in how we think about continuity of being. Every moment of your existence, your atoms are being replaced, your cells are dying and regenerating, your neural pathways are reconfiguring themselves, yet you maintain an unquestioned sense of continuous identity. You are not the same person you were 7 years ago at the molecular level, yet you do not experience this gradual replacement as a form of death. The teleportation scenario simply compresses this process into an instantaneous moment, forcing us to confront the question we normally avoid. If gradual cellular replacement preserves identity, why does instantaneous replacement feel like death? What has normalized this paradox despite its logical incoherence is our desperate psychological need to maintain a sense of unified self. We have constructed elaborate philosophical frameworks to avoid examining this contradiction too closely, preferring instead to live with the comfortable fiction that some unchanging essence persists within us. Yet this illusion serves us well. It allows us to form relationships, make commitments, and navigate a world that would become psychologically unbearable if we truly grasp the moment-to-moment dissolution of everything we call ourselves. The teletransportation paradox thus becomes less a puzzle to be solved and more a mirror reflecting the constructed nature of identity itself. Perhaps this is why the teleportation paradox haunts us so persistently. It strips away the protective illusion and forces us to acknowledge that identity has always been a story we tell ourselves rather than a fundamental truth embedded in the fabric of reality. And in that moment of naked awareness, we glimpse something both terrifying and liberating about what we actually are. The ancient philosophical tradition of questioning the ship of Theseus, whether a vessel remains itself after all its planks are replaced, suddenly becomes not merely an abstract puzzle, but an urgent existential interrogation about whether we ourselves are anything more than ships constantly rebuilding themselves, unaware of the reconstruction occurring at every moment. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that this paradox may not have a solution at all, not because we lack sufficient philosophical sophistication, but because the question itself assumes a metaphysical fact about identity that may simply not exist in the universe, leaving us to accept that the self we spend our entire lives protecting and preserving might be nothing more than a useful fiction constructed by consciousness observing itself. Yet in accepting this possibility, we find an unexpected freedom. If identity is indeed a constructed narrative rather than an immutable essence, then the teleportation chamber becomes not a tomb but a threshold, and the duplicate stepping out at the destination would be no less you than the person who stepped in, both equally valid continuations of a story that was always more fluid than. Imagine a patient lying on an operating table, their corpus callosum about to be severed, that thick bundle of nerve fibers containing roughly 200 million axons that serves as the primary communication highway between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And as the surgeon completes this procedure to treat severe epilepsy, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling begins to emerge in the weeks and months that follow. When researchers test these patients using specialized visual experiments where information is presented only to one hemisphere at a time, they discover that each hemisphere appears to possess its own consciousness, its own preferences, its own desires, and its own sense of selfhood. And yet these two minds inhabit a single body controlled by a unified motor system that must somehow coordinate their conflicting intentions into a single set of actions. One hemisphere might want to become an engineer while the other aspires to be a draftsman. One might prefer certain colors or foods while the other rejects them entirely, and both seem to have genuine subjective experiences, genuine thoughts, and what we might call genuine emotional reactions to stimuli. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on the fundamental architecture of human consciousness, and the question of whether consciousness is necessarily unified or whether it merely appears unified through the constant communication between separate processing centers. Because when that communication is severed, the illusion dissolves, and we are forced to confront the possibility that you yourself might contain multiple centers of awareness pretending to be one. That the unified self you experience might be a comfortable fiction maintained by neural synchronization rather than a genuine singular entity. What makes this paradox so persistently unsettling is not simply the existence of these split brain phenomena in laboratory conditions, but rather our continued insistence on maintaining the narrative of singular selfhood in ordinary life, our refusal to acknowledge that the brain's architecture naturally supports multiple simultaneous processing streams that only feel unified because they are constantly in dialogue with one another. And our comfortable assumption that consciousness must be singular despite mounting evidence that it might be fundamentally plural, and that only the intact corpus callosum creates the comfortable illusion of wholeness that we mistake for evidence of a unified soul. Yet perhaps the most vertiginous implication lies in recognizing that this fragmentation is not some rare pathological condition, but rather an exaggeration of what occurs in all our minds, that the very unity we experience in our consciousness might be perpetually reconstructed moment by moment through neural negotiation, a democratically reached consensus between competing subsystems rather than the decree of some singular executive homunculus. And if this is true, then the split-brain patient is not fundamentally different from you or me, but rather represents a condition where the usual negotiating mechanism has been disrupted, revealing the plural nature of mind that persists hidden beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness in every human being who has ever believed themselves to be singular and whole. This realization transforms the split-brain paradox from a curiosity about neurological pathology into a mirror held up to the nature of selfhood itself, forcing us to consider whether the unified I that seems to author our thoughts and direct our actions is itself an emergent narrative constructed retroactively by a brain that operates as a coalition of competing interests, each convinced of its own autonomy while remaining fundamentally dependent on the others for the coherent self we imagine ourselves to be. This explains why you might find yourself wanting contradictory things simultaneously, why your hand sometimes seems to act against your conscious intention, why you can believe something intellectually while your body reacts as though you believe something entirely different, not as psychological quirks or moral failures, but as glimpses of the underlying multiplicity that the corpus callosum normally reconciles into the seamless fiction of a unified self. The split-brain patient, then, becomes not an aberration but a revelation, a temporary lifting of the veil that normally obscures the collaborative nature of consciousness, showing us that the unified self we cherish so dearly is perhaps the brain's most elaborate and necessary fiction, maintained. Imagine a philosopher named Tyler sitting in his study, contemplating the nature of meaning and reference, when suddenly an exact duplicate of himself materializes in a distant swamp. This duplicate, let us call him Swampman, has the identical brain, identical neural patterns, identical physical composition down to the atomic level, yet he exists in a world he has never actually encountered before. Both Tylers think the word water in precisely the same way, their neurons firing in identical sequences, their thoughts feeling subjectively identical to themselves. And yet when original Tyler thinks about water, he is thinking about the H2O molecules he has experienced throughout his life, while Swampman's thought, despite being physically indistinguishable, refers to something different entirely because the actual causal history connecting his brain to the world is fundamentally altered. This is the paradox proposed by philosopher Hilary Putnam in 1975, and it challenges everything we believe about how meaning works and where thoughts come from. The mechanism underlying this puzzle operates on a principle called externalism, which suggests that the content of our thoughts depends not solely on what is happening inside our heads, but on the actual causal relationship between our minds and the external world. It seems intuitively wrong because we assume that if two beings are physically identical in every possible way, they must be thinking identical thoughts. Yet this thought experiment forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that meaning might be fundamentally dependent on context, on history, on the specific world we happen to inhabit rather than on our internal states alone. What makes this paradox particularly haunting is how it undermines our sense of psychological autonomy and the transparency of our own thoughts, suggesting that we may not have complete access to what our own minds actually mean, that something external to us is constantly participating in the construction of our thoughts without our awareness or consent. Despite decades of philosophical analysis, we have somehow managed to continue living and communicating as if the Swampman problem does not exist, treating our thoughts as stable referential entities even though the experiment suggests they might be fundamentally unstable, dependent on factors beyond our cognitive grasp. We construct elaborate theories, we refine arguments, we develop responses, yet the core discomfort remains embedded in how we understand consciousness itself, how we imagine that being and thinking relate to each other, and what it means for a thought to be truly ours when the world itself participates in determining what that thought means. Perhaps the deepest implication is that we are not isolated minds contemplating a world from behind a veil of consciousness, but rather we are fundamentally entangled with our environment, our thoughts reaching outward into the world even as the world reaches inward to shape what we think, suggesting that the boundary between self and world is far more permeable than our introspective intuitions would have us believe. This permeability reveals itself in countless subtle ways. The words we use carry the histories of those who spoke them before us. The concepts we think are shaped by the cultures we inhabit, and even our most private thoughts bear the fingerprints of a world we did not choose, but into which we were born, suggesting that autonomy itself might be less about independence from the world and more about the particular way we are woven into it. The Swampman Experiment thus becomes not a mere logical puzzle, but a profound recognition that our thoughts are conversations between mind and world, dialogues in which we are always already participants rather than authors, reminding us that to think at all is to be in relationship with something beyond ourselves, and that this relationship is not a flaw in our cognition, but its very foundation. In this light, Putnam's swamp creature becomes less a reductio ad absurdum and more a mirror reflecting back our own embeddedness in the world, revealing that the very act of naming something, water, love, justice, is an act of reaching toward a shared reality that we inhabit together, and that meaning emerges not from the isolated fortress of individual minds, but from the intricate web of causal connections that bind us to each other and to everything we encounter. Consider the peculiar fact that you believe yourself to be the same person you were 10 years ago, despite the scientific reality that virtually every atom in your body has been replaced. Your brain has formed entirely new neural pathways. Your beliefs have shifted dramatically. Your preferences have evolved beyond recognition. And the person you were has been systematically dismantled and reconstructed so thoroughly that almost nothing material remains of who you once were. Yet you maintain an unbroken sense of continuous selfhood, as though some essential unchanging essence persists throughout this total transformation. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through something called narrative continuity, whereby your consciousness stitches together a story of uninterrupted selfhood by connecting each day to the next through memory and emotional threads, creating the illusion of an enduring identity, even though the actual substrate of that identity undergoes complete metamorphosis multiple times across a lifetime. Your brain essentially manufactures retrospective coherence, reaching backward to construct a tale in which all your past selves were always heading toward who you are now, when in reality you have been dozens of different people wearing the same name and occupying the same legal designation. This phenomenon persists with remarkable stubbornness, despite the fact that we have known for centuries that this sense of identity is fundamentally illusory, that the ship of Theseus paradox applies directly to human beings, that personal identity cannot logically survive such radical transformation. And yet we continue to treat ourselves and others as though we are singular unchanging entities moving through time rather than temporal sequences of distinct consciousness instances, connected only by the fragile thread of memory and narrative convenience. We have normalized this profound logical inconsistency so completely that questioning it feels absurd, that suggesting you are not the same person as your childhood self feels like philosophical pedantry rather than literal observation, and that we maintain elaborate social and legal systems built entirely upon the fiction of persistent identity, even though the foundation beneath those systems has no coherent philosophical support whatsoever. Yet we stake our entire moral framework on this fiction, holding people accountable for crimes committed by bodies they no longer inhabit, expecting promises made by past selves to bind future selves, constructing punishment and reward systems as though there exists some persistent entity to be held responsible, when perhaps we are merely punishing one temporal instance of a person for actions performed by an entirely different temporal instance who happen to share their name and skeleton. And yet this fiction is not merely harmless. It shapes how we love, how we forgive, how we demand justice, and how we imagine our own futures, making the illusion of persistent identity perhaps the most consequential philosophical error we have collectively chosen to embrace, not because it is true, but because the alternative, acknowledging that we are strangers to our former selves and cannot truly promise what our future selves will become, would require us to rebuild almost everything about how we organize human society. Perhaps this is why we cling so desperately to the stories we tell about ourselves, not despite their fundamental unreliability, but because they are all we have ever had to stand against the vertigo of genuine discontinuity, and to release that grip would be to admit that the person reading these words right now will soon be replaced by someone else who merely believes they are you. And so we choose our narratives carefully, constructing identities like architects building on constantly shifting ground, knowing at some level that the structure is temporary but proceeding as though it will stand forever, because the act of narration itself is what keeps us from dissolving entirely into the meaningless flux of becoming. This is precisely why we document our lives obsessively, collecting photographs, writing journals, recording videos. As though by freezing moments in amber, we might convince ourselves that some stable self persists beneath the perpetual renovation, when perhaps we are simply creating increasingly elaborate monuments to people who no longer exist, hoping that by making them memorable enough, we can retroactively make them real. Consider the famous ship of Theseus, that legendary vessel which carried the hero back from Crete after his victory over the Minotaur, and imagine that this ship was preserved by the Athenians as a sacred monument to their greatest champion, displayed in their harbor for all citizens to witness and admire. Over the passing decades and centuries, as the wooden planks began to rot and splinter from exposure to salt water and the relentless sun, the Athenians would carefully replace each damaged board with a new one, always selecting timber of the finest quality to honor their hero's memory. They would replace the hull planks, then the deck, then the mast, and eventually even the smallest nails and fixtures until, after sufficient time had elapsed, not a single piece of the original ship remained, every component having been substituted with new material. Yet the Athenians still called it the ship of Theseus, still treated it with reverence, still pointed to it as the authentic vessel that had sailed so long ago. Now consider a second version of this paradox. Imagine that each plank removed from the original ship was carefully preserved and collected, and that some cunning craftsperson gathered all these discarded original pieces and reconstructed them into a ship-shaped object, claiming this assembled vessel of entirely original materials was the true ship of Theseus. Suddenly we face an impossible question with no logical resolution. Which ship deserves the name? Which one truly is the ship of Theseus? And what does identity even mean when material continuity fractures against functional continuity? This paradox reveals something profoundly unsettling about how we construct identity itself, whether for objects, institutions, or even for ourselves as human beings. Our bodies replace nearly all their cells over the course of 7 to 10 years, meaning the physical matter composing you today bears almost no material resemblance to the matter composing you a decade ago. Yet we insist you remain fundamentally you, that your identity persists despite this total material turnover. Corporations persist for centuries, while every employee turns over multiple times. Nations maintain their identity through constitutions, while their citizens constantly die and are replaced. And yet we accept these continuities without examining the contradiction. We have created elaborate social and legal systems predicated on the assumption that continuous gradual change preserves identity, while sudden complete change destroys it, though there exists no logical foundation for this distinction. Perhaps most strangely, we have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that questioning it feels almost absurd, almost like we are being unnecessarily pedantic about what everyone already understands implicitly. Yet when you press the matter philosophically, that implicit understanding evaporates entirely, leaving only the paradox in its place, a foundational puzzle about identity that has persisted for thousands of years without resolution, in which we simply continue living around rather than through, accepting the paradox as a permanent feature of existence itself. Perhaps this is why we find the paradox so disturbing. It suggests that identity itself is not a discovered property of the world, but rather a convenient fiction we maintain through collective agreement, a story we tell about continuity because the alternative, acknowledging that identity is arbitrary and contingent, would force us to confront the unsettling possibility that we are all, in a profound sense, ships being continuously dismantled and reconstructed. And that what makes us ourselves is nothing more than our willingness to keep calling ourselves by the same name. And yet we cling to this fiction with desperate intensity, resisting the vertigo that comes from seeing through it, because to truly accept that identity is a story we tell rather than a truth we discover would be to acknowledge that we are fundamentally unstable, that the self is less a thing than a process, less a noun than a verb, and perhaps that recognition, terrifying as it is, might be the only honest way to live. Yet perhaps the paradox loses some of its terror when we recognize that this instability is not a flaw in our nature, but rather its greatest strength. The ship of Theseus remains functional, purposeful, and beloved precisely because it can change while remaining itself, and we too might find freedom in accepting that our identity is less a fixed destination than an ongoing voyage, less a thing to possess than a story. Consider the profound medical reality that surgeons can remove an entire hemisphere of the human brain, leaving a person fundamentally alive, conscious, and capable of forming new memories, learning language, recognizing faces, and maintaining their sense of self. Yet despite this extraordinary demonstration of neuroplasticity and cerebral redundancy, we continue to structure our entire understanding of human cognition around the assumption that specific functions reside in specific locations, with little to no flexibility or capacity for reorganization. When a child undergoes hemispherectomy due to severe epilepsy or injury, their remaining hemisphere gradually assumes control over functions that were supposedly hardwired into the removed half. Yet neuroscience textbooks still present the brain as a rigid map of localized functions where damage means permanent loss, creating a cognitive dissonance between what clinical evidence shows us and what we believe about the architecture of consciousness itself. The mechanism underlying this paradox appears to rest on our preference for elegant simplicity over messy biological reality. For the idea of a localized function feels more scientifically rigorous and teachable than the unsettling truth that the brain is a vastly plastic, redundant system capable of extraordinary reorganization when necessity demands it. And perhaps we resist updating our models because accepting true neuroplasticity forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of identity, whether our personality and abilities are truly fixed properties or merely current configurations that could shift dramatically with injury or intervention. What persists most strangely is not the scientific ignorance, but rather our collective psychological investment in the notion that our brains are stable, unchanging organs that define us absolutely. When the hemispherectomy phenomenon stares directly at this assumption and declares it fundamentally false. Yet we discuss these cases as medical curiosities rather than as evidence that demands a complete reconceptualization of how we understand the relationship between brain structure and human capability. And this stubborn persistence of outdated models, despite overwhelming clinical contradiction, suggests that what we resist updating is not a scientific theory, but rather our deepest assumptions about what it means to be a fixed, coherent self in a body that proves far more fluid and adaptive than we wish to believe. Perhaps the deepest puzzle is not why hemispherectomy patients survive, but why we find their survival so philosophically unsettling. Why a child who loses half their brain yet retains their essential self forces us to question whether the self was ever as localized, as fixed, or as dependent on any particular neural geography as we assumed, suggesting that our resistance to updating neuroscience models may ultimately reflect a far more primitive anxiety about the contingency of identity itself. And yet, if we truly accepted this, if we allowed hemispherectomy patients to teach us that identity is not a fixed property, but an emergent process capable of radical reorganization, we would have to reimagine not just neuroscience, but our entire approach to brain injury, learning disabilities, and the treatment of neurological conditions. Shifting from a model of irreversible localized damage to one of dynamic potential, constrained only by the limits of neural connectivity and developmental timing. Yet we see glimpses of this paradigm shift emerging in rehabilitation protocols that now emphasize intensive practice and environmental enrichment rather than accepting deficits as permanent, in our growing willingness to attempt neural rewiring in stroke patients and those with spinal injuries, in the recognition that childhood brain injuries often carry better prognoses than adult ones precisely because the young brain retains greater plasticity. Suggesting that perhaps the hemispherectomy patient is not an anomaly, but rather an extreme expression of capacities that exist along a continuum throughout the lifespan, waiting only for sufficient necessity and focused effort to activate. What remains to be seen is whether we can learn to recognize this potential not as exceptional, but as foundational, whether we might finally stop asking, how do hemispherectomy patients survive? And start asking instead, what does their survival reveal about the ordinary plasticity we ignore in ourselves, and what capacities might we unlock if we approached every brain, every learner, every recoverant? Consider the strange phenomenon whereby we continue to engage in behaviors, maintain beliefs, or uphold systems that we ourselves recognize as ineffective, contradictory, or even harmful. Yet we persist with them anyway despite having full awareness of their futility, and this persists not because we lack the ability to change or because external forces compel us, but rather because the very act of persistence itself becomes the justification for continuation. The persistence paradox manifests most clearly in our relationship with productivity systems that we know do not work for us. We maintain elaborate schedules and frameworks that we have tried repeatedly, failed with repeatedly, and yet we continue to return to them with each new year or new season, each time hoping that perhaps this iteration will be different despite having no logical reason to believe that changing nothing about our implementation will somehow change the outcome. Similarly, we persist in relationships that lack genuine connection, in jobs that drain our vitality, in routines that bring us no joy, and the mechanism that sustains this persistence is not stubbornness or ignorance, but rather a peculiar psychological protection mechanism, wherein the sunk cost of our effort becomes reframed as evidence that we should continue rather than evidence that we should stop, so that the longer we have persisted with something ineffective, the more irrational it becomes to abandon it, yet the more committed we become to defending its value. This operates through a kind of cognitive momentum, whereby the act of continuing something becomes its own justification, because to stop would be to admit that the time and energy already invested was wasted, and so we pour more time and energy into justifying the initial investment rather than recognizing that this justification itself becomes the true waste. The paradox deepens when we understand that the very awareness we have of this contradiction does not resolve it. Knowing that we are trapped in a cycle of unjustifiable persistence does not automatically free us from it, and in some cases, our awareness of the paradox simply becomes another layer of the persistence itself, another reason to continue, because now we have invested consciousness and acknowledgement into the pattern. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly in human existence that we have created entire cultural narratives around it, celebrating persistence as a virtue even when persistence serves no evolutionary, practical, or emotional purpose, and we honor those who persist longest in the face of evidence that they should not persist at all, and this normalization disguises the paradox as wisdom rather than revealing it for what it truly is, a psychological trap disguised as character strength. The cruelest aspect of this trap is that genuine persistence, the kind that actually matters, that builds mastery or sustains us through legitimate hardship, becomes indistinguishable from its paradoxical counterpart, so we cannot reliably tell whether we are demonstrating admirable resilience or merely performing a culturally sanctioned form of self-harm, and this uncertainty itself becomes another reason to continue, because stopping might mean we were quitting when we should have persisted. And so we remain suspended in a state of productive paralysis, neither fully committed to our chosen path nor willing to abandon it, all while telling ourselves that this liminal space, this refusal to choose, is itself a form of wisdom, a mature acceptance of complexity, when in truth it is simply persistence wearing the mask of thoughtfulness, another iteration of the same trap wearing a more sophisticated disguise. The most insidious part is that we mistake this paralysis for thoughtfulness itself, believing that our inability to decide represents a kind of epistemic humility, when really it is just another mechanism by which persistence disguises itself. We persist in indecision as fervently as we persist in failed systems, and the longer we remain suspended in this uncertainty, the more we convince ourselves that our refusal to choose was the wisest choice all along. Until one day we realized that the choice to stop was always available to us, yet we had persisted so thoroughly in believing it was not that the option had become genuinely invisible, not because it did not exist in reality, but because we had constructed such an elaborate psychological architecture around its impossibility that we could no longer perceive it, and by then the paradox has completed its cycle. We have Imagine that a scientist has invented a perfect teleportation machine, one that scans every atom in your body, creates an exact duplicate of you at a distant location, and then disintegrates the original, and you are faced with the question of whether you should step into that machine knowing that the you that emerges on the other side will be identical in every measurable way, possessing all your memories and personality traits and the conviction that they are you. Yet the original you will cease to exist in the process, which raises the unsettling question of whether this constitutes survival or merely the creation of a copy while you die, a paradox that cuts to the heart of personal identity and consciousness in ways that our everyday intuitions cannot resolve. The mechanism behind this puzzle operates in the gap between our materialist assumptions and our subjective sense of continuity, for we assume that if something is physically identical, it must be the same thing. Yet our intuitive sense of self suggests that there is something more than mere physical configuration that makes you persistently you, something that could not be duplicated or transferred. And this tension reveals a fundamental uncertainty about what personal identity actually is, and whether it depends on physical continuity or psychological continuity, or perhaps on an unbroken stream of consciousness that cannot survive a moment of discontinuity. We navigate this paradox by quietly accepting that teleportation would be safe and survivable, that stepping into the machine would be rational and equivalent to ordinary travel. Yet when we truly examine our own intuitions, most of us harbor a deep resistance to this conclusion, a conviction that we would die even if our copy lived on, which exposes how profoundly mysterious our own existence remains to us despite all our scientific understanding. And how we live with this contradiction without resolving it, how we build technologies and theories on the assumption that we are just matter, while simultaneously clinging to the intuition that something irreducible persists in consciousness beyond the physical substrate. And this unresolved tension sits quietly at the foundation of how we think about ourselves and remains largely unexamined in daily life. Perhaps this is why we recoil from the thought experiment even as we accept its logical conclusion, because it forces us to confront the possibility that the self we experience as unified and continuous might be an illusion, a story we tell ourselves moment to moment, and that accepting teleportation would mean surrendering our deepest conviction that there is something irreplaceable about our particular perspective on the world. Yet perhaps the real insight lies not in resolving the paradox, but in recognizing that this discomfort reveals something true about consciousness itself. That our sense of self may depend less on what we are than on the continuity of our experience, and that any break in that stream, whether by teleportation or sleep or the constant molecular replacement our bodies undergo, forces us to confront the unsettling possibility that identity is not a thing we possess, but a process we perform, moment after moment, with no guarantee that the performer remains the same. And yet we do not experience ourselves this way in ordinary life. We feel like continuous beings, unified across time, which suggests that either consciousness is genuinely continuous despite the physical discontinuities we now know occur within us, or that our sense of continuity is itself a constructed narrative, so compelling that it creates the very identity it purports to discover, leaving us unable to distinguish between a self that persists and a self that is perpetually recreated. This uncertainty mirrors the ancient paradox of the ship of Theseus. If every plank is replaced, is it still the same ship? Yet with the crucial difference that teleportation forces the question into a single, irreversible moment, stripping away the comfortable illusion of gradual continuity that allows us to accept the constant renewal of our physical form without existential vertigo. And in this way, the teleportation problem becomes a mirror held up to the human condition itself. We are all, in a sense, ships being rebuilt plank by plank, yet we desperately need to believe in the continuity of the self to make sense of our choices, our relationships, and our mortality, which means we may be less interested in solving the paradox than in preserving the useful fiction that allows us to live without constantly. Consider the fundamental trajectory of our universe as physicists have described it through the second law of thermodynamics, a principle so mathematically robust and experimentally verified that it stands as one of the most reliable predictions in all of science. Yet it presents us with a paradox that few truly contemplate in its full existential weight. The heat death of the universe describes an inevitable future state in which all energy gradients have been exhausted, all matter has decayed into its most elementary particles, and the cosmos exists in a state of perfect thermodynamic equilibrium at a temperature approaching absolute zero. A scenario so distant in the future that it exists almost entirely outside human comprehension. Yet it is simultaneously considered an absolute certainty by the vast majority of cosmologists and physicists who study such matters. The paradox emerges from a profound logical tension that lies dormant in how we conceptualize time, entropy, and the nature of causality itself. Because if the universe is inexorably moving toward maximum entropy and heat death, then every moment that passes represents an increase in disorder and a decrease in the available energy that could theoretically power complex structures like stars, galaxies, life, and consciousness itself. Which means that the universe is fundamentally running down like a clock winding toward silence. Yet this creates a conceptual impossibility when we examine the origins of the universe, because if entropy is always increasing, then the universe must have begun in a state of extraordinarily low entropy, which raises the question of why the initial conditions of the universe were so finely ordered and improbable, and who or what established those conditions in the first place, and this question remains unanswered by our current physics. The psychological mechanism that allows us to live with this paradox is a form of temporal dissociation, where we acknowledge the mathematical certainty of heat death in academic contexts while simultaneously operating under the implicit assumption that the universe, or at least our corner of it, will persist in some meaningful form indefinitely, allowing us to make long-term plans and maintain hopes for distant futures that may ultimately be irrelevant. We have normalized this contradiction by compartmentalizing our thinking, treating the heat-death scenario as something that happens to the universe in general terms, rather than as an absolute truth that constrains all possibility, all meaning, and all purpose. And in this way, we continue to construct narratives of progress and improvement, despite knowing that all structures will eventually crumble into thermodynamic equilibrium. This persistent paradox reflects a fundamental human need to believe in continuity and meaning even when confronted with scientific evidence that suggests the opposite. And so we continue forward, knowing what we know, choosing not to fully integrate the implications into our daily consciousness. Perhaps this is not a flaw in human cognition, but rather a necessary feature of it, a productive denial that allows meaning-making organisms to function within a universe indifferent to their projects. And in accepting this paradox without resolution, we find ourselves in the strange position of being the only known entities capable of contemplating our own obsolescence while simultaneously building monuments, writing books, and falling in love as though eternity were assured. And perhaps this is precisely where human dignity resides, not in the conquest of entropy or the extension of existence beyond heat-death, but in the defiant act of creating meaning in full knowledge of its ultimate futility, transforming the paradox itself into a kind of freedom, where we are liberated to choose what matters precisely because nothing, in the end, will matter at all. This is the strange mathematics of human existence. We are temporary arrangements of matter that have become conscious of their own temporality, and in that consciousness we discover not despair, but the very ground upon which all authentic meaning must stand. For meaning requires stakes, requires endings, requires the knowledge that what we do matters precisely because we cannot do it forever. The love letter written today will outlast the star that lights the page for only a few billion years more. The theorem proved this morning joins the vast architecture of human knowledge that will eventually dissolve into radiation and silence, yet neither loses its power or truth in the present moment. And imagine standing at a precipice where time folds back upon itself infinitely, where every decision you have ever made, every word you have ever spoken, every moment you have ever experienced will repeat exactly as it occurred, not once, but endlessly across eternity, and you are somehow conscious through all of it, aware that this exact sequence will happen again and again without variation or escape. This is the philosophical concept known as eternal return, a paradox that has haunted human consciousness since ancient times and was revived most prominently by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who proposed it not merely as a logical puzzle, but as a thought experiment designed to expose how we actually live and what we truly value. The mechanism behind this paradox operates on a peculiar psychological level that reveals something uncomfortable about human nature and our relationship with meaning itself. Because if every moment were destined to repeat eternally, then the concept of progress becomes meaningless, the idea of escape becomes impossible, and the notion that we are building towards something better in the future dissolves entirely. Yet here lies the true paradox. When confronted with the thought of eternal return, most people do not immediately embrace it as liberation or despair as they logically should, but instead experience a strange mixture of both, a recognition that if they truly believed this were the case, they would have to fundamentally reorganize their entire existence around accepting rather than resisting the present moment. The persistence of this paradox in human thought despite its psychological weight suggests that we harbor a deep, often unspoken suspicion that we are already living in something close to eternal return, that we repeat the same patterns, make the same mistakes, chase the same hollow satisfactions, speak the same words in different contexts, and cycle through identical emotional landscapes with only the surface details changing. We have normalized this cyclical nature of existence by calling it routine, by dressing it up in the language of productivity and progress, by telling ourselves that each repetition is slightly different even when we sense it is not, and by refusing to fully contemplate what it would mean if every conversation you are having right now were to happen again exactly as it is, with you saying the same things, thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same subtle frustrations, forever and ever without end. Perhaps this is why the concept of eternal return remains so disturbing. It forces us to confront the possibility that we are not actually moving forward through time at all, but rather spinning in place, while the illusion of progress obscures the repetition beneath. And the only genuine choice we ever have is whether to accept this cycle with grace or to spend our eternity in quiet rebellion against the unchangeable nature of what we have already chosen to become. And perhaps the cruelest aspect of this realization is that the choice itself, between grace and rebellion, is also predetermined and eternal, meaning that even your acceptance or resistance of eternal return is something you will choose infinitely over and over, which suggests that the only true freedom available to us is the freedom to stop searching for freedom and instead find meaning in the very patterns we cannot escape. This paradox becomes most acute when we recognize that the people we love, the ones whose presence we claim to treasure above all else, are the very patterns we are most willing to repeat eternally, suggesting that perhaps eternal return is not a curse at all, but rather an accidental description of what love actually is. The willingness to choose the same person, the same conversation, the same ordinary moment of shared silence, not once but infinitely, as if each occurrence were the first and only time it could ever matter. Yet even this understanding of eternal return through love contains a hidden trap. The moment we recognize love as our salvation from the meaninglessness of repetition, we risk transforming love itself into another illusion of progress, another way of telling ourselves that the cycles matter because they involve someone we cherish, when perhaps the deepest truth is that eternal return asks us simply to love the repetition itself, not because it leads anywhere, but because the repetition is all there ever was. Consider the phenomenon of cyclical time loops as they manifest in human experience, where patterns repeat with such precision that observers begin to question whether forward progression is genuinely occurring at all. And in examining this peculiar aspect of existence, we find ourselves confronted with situations where the same circumstances, the same conversations, the same emotional crises seem to emerge with disturbing regularity despite our conscious efforts to alter their trajectory. As if some invisible force compels us to traverse the same psychological and behavioral pathways repeatedly throughout our lives and lifetimes. In the real world, this manifests as people returning to the same toxic relationships after periods of absence, communities cycling through identical economic crises separated by decades, nations replaying the same political conflicts with different figureheads, individuals making identical mistakes in different contexts, and civilizations repeating the same patterns of rise and collapse that their predecessors experienced centuries earlier with such fidelity that historians can predict outcomes with eerie accuracy. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through several interconnected pathways, beginning with the fact that human consciousness operates within deeply ingrained neural patterns and behavioral loops that become increasingly difficult to break the longer they persist, creating what neuroscientists call attractor states, where the mind gravitationally returns to familiar configurations regardless of intention. And this is compounded by the selective memory function, where we unconsciously minimize or reframe past failures in ways that make us susceptible to repeating them, believing this iteration will be different while possessing insufficient psychological distance to recognize the structural similarities. Furthermore, cyclical time loops persist at societal levels through institutional memory failures, where each generation must relearn lessons their predecessors paid dearly to acquire, through economic systems that incentivize cyclical consumption and crisis, and through cultural narratives that normalize repetition as natural rather than recognizing it as a constraint worth examining. What renders this phenomenon so particularly disquieting is how thoroughly normalized it has become in human consciousness, how we describe recurring failure patterns with almost whimsical language like history repeating itself, as though cycles are inevitable features of existence rather than systematic failures of learning, adaptation, and genuine transformation. And yet we persist in this acceptance, despite possessing cognitive tools and documented knowledge that should theoretically allow us to break these loops, suggesting that the cyclical nature of human experience may serve deeper psychological or existential functions we have yet to fully comprehend. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that these loops persist because breaking them requires a degree of self-knowledge and behavioral change that exceeds what most individuals and institutions are psychologically equipped to sustain, and that what we interpret as cosmic inevitability may simply be the cumulative weight of billions of small surrenders to the familiar. The recognition of this pattern, that we choose the familiar over the difficult, offers a paradoxical consolation. If cyclical time loops are maintained through our collective choices rather than imposed by external forces, then theoretically, sufficiently coordinated consciousness could interrupt them, Yet this possibility remains largely theoretical precisely because the coordination required would itself demand breaking the very loops that prevent such unified action. In this sense, we are not trapped in cycles so much as we are participants in a recursive system where awareness of the trap becomes another layer of the trap itself. The individual who recognizes they are caught in a cycle and attempts to escape often finds themselves performing the recognition itself as part of the cycle, studying their own patterns with the same obsessive attention that originally created them, transforming self-awareness into another loop of rumination that prevents the spontaneous action necessary for genuine change. This suggests that the exit from cyclical time may not arrive through understanding, but through a kind of forgetting, a deliberate relinquishment of the very consciousness that identified the problem in the first place. Consider the moment when you ask yourself why you believe something to be true, and then you ask why that reason is true, and then why that reason is true, descending endlessly into a chain of justifications that never reaches solid ground, never arrives at a foundation that requires no further explanation, a phenomenon known as infinite regress that haunts not only philosophy, but the practical architecture of how we navigate daily existence without acknowledging it. When a parent tells a child that they must do something because they said so, and the child asks why they should listen, and the parent responds, because I am your parent, and the child asks why being a parent grants authority, and the parent struggles to find an answer that does not circle back to the original claim, we witness infinite regress embedded in the ordinary structures of human relationships and social hierarchy. The mechanism operates through our reliance on chains of causation and justification that theoretically should terminate in some foundational truth or principle. Yet when we examine them closely, we discover that each link in the chain merely points backward to another link requiring its own justification, creating a logical loop that can spiral infinitely without ever satisfying the fundamental human need for understanding why things are the way they are. Knowledge itself becomes uncertain when we realize that to know something, we must know the basis of that knowledge, and to know the basis, we must know something that justifies the basis, an unending cascade of prerequisites that suggests all certainty rests upon an abyss of unjustified assumptions. We have normalized this paradox by developing practical shortcuts, by establishing conventions and institutions that simply declare certain truths to be self-evident or axiomatic, allowing us to stop asking questions at designated points in our reasoning. Yet this acceptance does not resolve the underlying problem, but merely allows us to sleep at night by deliberately choosing not to examine it further. The persistence of infinite regress in human thought reveals that perhaps absolute certainty was never the true goal of our minds, but rather the construction of sufficiently stable narratives that allow us to function, to make decisions, to move forward despite the vertiginous realization that if we trace back far enough, we may find that the ground beneath our entire system of belief simply does not exist. Perhaps this is why we build institutions and rituals that demand we stop questioning at certain points, not from intellectual weakness, but from a deep understanding that infinite dissent would paralyze us entirely, and so we collectively agree to treat certain foundational claims as beyond scrutiny, transforming a logical problem into a social necessity that allows civilization itself to function. Yet even in this deliberately constructed stability, cracks appear. The scientist who must assume the reliability of their instruments without proving that reliability, the judge who must interpret laws without a law that governs interpretation itself, the lover who must trust another person without logical grounds for that trust, each of us perpetually standing on ground we have chosen not to examine, aware at some level that the choice itself is the only solid thing we possess. And perhaps this is the deepest wisdom infinite regress teaches us, that the act of choosing where to stop questioning is itself an act of faith, a recognition that some foundations are built not through logic, but through the courage to say, this is enough, and that civilization flourishes not despite this necessary blindness, but because of our collective willingness to embrace it. The parent who says, because I said so, and the scientist who calibrates her instruments both perform the same essential act. They plant a flag in the infinite and declare it sufficient, transforming the vertigo of groundlessness into the solid ground of decisive action, and in doing so they reveal that meaning itself is not discovered in the depths but created at the surface, in the moment we choose to stop descending and begin building upward instead. This is why the child who stops asking why and accepts the parent's authority is not defeated by logic, but initiated into the social contract that makes human life possible, and why we should view infinite regress not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be managed with wisdom, knowing that the deepest truths often hide not at the bottom of endless chains, but in the deliberate choice to climb B. Consider the statement that reads, "This sentence is false," a proposition that creates an infinite loop of logical collapse the moment you attempt to evaluate its truth value. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims, and if it is false, then it must be true as its falsehood would make the claim accurate, leaving you suspended in a state of perpetual contradiction that your mind cannot resolve through conventional reasoning. This fundamental problem extends far beyond abstract philosophical exercises and into the very fabric of how we construct language, build belief systems, and organize our understanding of reality itself. Because whenever we create any system of rules or logic, we inevitably include within that system statements about the system itself, which means the system becomes entangled with its own foundation in ways that traditional logic cannot cleanly separate or categorize. The psychological mechanism that allows this paradox to exist is rooted in our brain's natural tendency to process information hierarchically, separating observer from observed, subject from object, rule from exception. Yet self-reference violently collapses these necessary distinctions and forces us to confront situations where something must simultaneously belong to a category and sit outside that same category with equal logical validity. We encounter this phenomenon constantly in real life through statements like "all rules have exceptions," which is itself a rule that should logically have an exception, or through the observation that nobody can ever be completely honest, which itself claims to be an honest statement, or through the experience of skepticism where being skeptical about whether skepticism is valid creates a self-undermining loop that we simply accept and move forward from without resolution. What is perhaps most fascinating is how thoroughly we have normalized this paradox despite its logical incoherence, treating it as merely interesting rather than catastrophic, which suggests that human consciousness does not actually require perfect logical consistency to function, and perhaps even benefits from the flexibility that self-reference paradoxes provide by allowing our thinking to remain fluid and adaptive rather than rigid and mathematically determined. This capacity to hold contradictions without neurological breakdown may represent an evolutionary advantage rather than a limitation, allowing us to navigate a world that resists perfect categorization and to revise our understanding of ourselves even as we use that understanding to do the revising, creating a kind of productive instability that rigid logical systems can never achieve. The moment we attempt to build an artificial intelligence that can reason about itself, we rediscover this same paradox, a system that must model its own processing while using that very processing to do the modeling, which is why the most sophisticated algorithms still encounter logical dead ends when asked to evaluate their own reliability or to determine whether they should trust their own conclusions about what they should trust. In this way, the self-reference paradox is not a problem to solve, but rather a permanent feature of any system complex enough to contain a representation of itself, a boundary condition that marks the difference between simple mechanisms and genuine understanding. And perhaps this is why the most profound moments of human insight often arrive not through logical deduction, but through a kind of leap beyond logic itself, when we suddenly accept a contradiction as true, and in that acceptance find ourselves transformed, suggesting that consciousness may have evolved precisely to transcend the limitations that pure reason imposes, turning paradox from an obstacle into a doorway. When we fall in love, create art, or make a moral commitment, we are essentially stepping through that doorway, choosing to believe in something that cannot be logically justified from within the system of our own reasoning, yet finding that this paradoxical leap is precisely what gives those experiences their meaning and power. The self-reference paradox thus reveals that the deepest truths about existence may not be those that can be perfectly stated, but rather those that can only be lived. And in that living, we discover that the paradox was never truly a flaw in our logic, but rather an invitation to recognize that meaning itself exists in the space between contradiction and resolution, where the self that asks the question cannot be separated from the self that answers it. Consider the strange phenomenon wherein an event appears to cause itself through a backwards chain of reasoning, where the effect becomes the justification for the cause that preceded it, creating a closed loop in time that defies our conventional understanding of how moments should unfold in sequence. Imagine a student who studies intensely for an exam because they believe they will fail, and their belief in potential failure drives them to study with such focus that they eventually succeed. Yet their success retroactively validates their original fear, as if the fear itself had been a necessary precondition for the outcome, when in fact it was merely their response to the fear that created the result. In another common scenario, a person avoids a particular route home every single day because of a vague sense of dread, and decades pass without incident on that road, and yet their consistent avoidance becomes the very evidence they cite to justify their initial apprehension, as though the absence of an accident proves that danger was lurking there all along, waiting to strike had they not been vigilant. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through selective attention and pattern recognition, wherein our minds automatically search for evidence that confirms our existing beliefs, and when we structure our behavior around a fear or expectation, we inadvertently create the conditions that make our original assumptions seem vindicated, even though the causal relationship flows backward from consequence to belief rather than forward from belief to consequence. We have normalized this temporal inversion so thoroughly that we rarely notice it, building entire systems of superstition, ritual, and preventative behavior on the foundation of backwards causality, convincing ourselves that our precautions caused the absence of harm rather than simply failing to test whether harm would have occurred anyway. The loop persists because breaking it requires us to distinguish between causation and correlation, between action and coincidence, a cognitive task so demanding that most people find it simpler to maintain the comfortable fiction that their fears were justified all along. Yet the cruelest aspect of this loop is that it becomes self-reinforcing across generations. A parent passes down their unfounded fear to a child not through explicit instruction but through the vigilance itself, and the child, witnessing the parent's careful avoidance, absorbs the unstated premise that danger must be real, thus inheriting a causal chain that never had a beginning, only an endless middle. In this way, the loop escapes the prison of individual psychology and becomes a cultural artifact, a shared hallucination that gains credibility simply through its persistence across time, until we can no longer distinguish between the wisdom our ancestors accumulated through genuine trial and error and the elaborate mythologies they constructed to explain away their own circular reasoning. And perhaps most disturbingly, we have built entire institutions around these inherited loops, medical systems that perpetuate unnecessary treatments, security apparatuses that justify their own existence through the dangers they claim to prevent, and educational frameworks that measure success by metrics designed to prove their own efficacy, each one a perfect temporal Ouroboros, consuming its own tail while insisting it was always meant to be food. The question then becomes whether we can ever truly escape such loops, or whether the very act of recognizing them merely creates a new layer of circular reasoning. We become vigilant about our vigilance, anxious about our anxiety, constructing an infinite regress of meta-loops that somehow feel more rational simply because we have named them. Perhaps the only escape lies not in breaking the loop, but in accepting its circularity as a fundamental feature of consciousness itself, acknowledging that we are creatures who must believe in order to act, and must act in order to validate our beliefs, and that this strange temporal knot is not a bug in human reasoning, but rather the price we pay for being beings capable of anticipation, imagination, and hope. Yet in embracing this circularity, we might discover that the loop's greatest danger lies not in its existence, but in our unconsciousness of it. For the moment we recognize ourselves as both the spider and the web, both the cause and the effect caught in our own reasoning, we gain the possibility, however slim, of choosing which loops to maintain and which to finally delibe. Consider for a moment the sheer improbability of your existence, the astronomical odds that had to align perfectly for you to be here, reading these words, at this exact moment in the vast and expanding universe, and then consider how rarely we pause to truly contemplate what this means about the nature of reality itself. The Anthropic Principle suggests that the universe we observe must be compatible with conscious life having emerged within it, because if it were not compatible, we would not be here to observe it, and this circular logic creates a profound paradox that sits at the very foundation of how we understand our place in the cosmos. When physicists calculate the fundamental constants that govern physical reality, they discover that if any of these values were adjusted by even the smallest fraction, the universe would collapse into itself or dissipate into formless chaos before stars could form, before planets could solidify, before chemistry could create the complex molecules necessary for life as we know it. The gravitational constant, the fine structure constant, the ratio of electron mass to proton mass, all appear to be calibrated with impossible precision to allow for our existence. and this discovery has led many scientists and philosophers to grapple with a troubling question that refuses to be easily answered. The Anthropic Principle operates by stating that we should not be surprised to find ourselves in a universe compatible with our existence, because we could only ever observe a universe compatible with our existence, meaning that the apparent fine-tuning of reality might not require explanation through divine design or infinite multiverse theories, but rather simply reflects an inevitable selection bias in our observations. Yet this reasoning creates a peculiar psychological trap, because it allows us to dismiss the profound improbability of our circumstances by claiming that our observation of the universe is predetermined to exclude all alternatives, transforming what feels like miraculous precision into a tautology that explains nothing while appearing to explain everything. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we rarely notice how circular it is, how it permits us to live comfortably with the impossible without ever truly resolving the tension between apparent design and apparent randomness. And in this normalization lies perhaps the deepest irony of all. For in accepting that we cannot step outside ourselves to view reality from a position of true neutrality, we concede that every framework we build to understand the universe is fundamentally constrained by the fact of our own presence within it, making the Anthropic Principle less a solution to the mystery of existence and more an admission of the ultimate limits of observational knowledge itself. And yet, paradoxically, this limitation may itself be the most honest epistemological position we can adopt, to acknowledge that the universe we study is irrevocably filtered through the lens of consciousness, and that perhaps the deepest truth is not that we are improbably suited to understanding reality, but that reality itself becomes intelligible only in the act of being observed by beings like ourselves. This is not to say that consciousness creates reality in some mystical sense, but rather that the very categories through which we parse existence, causation, time, matter, energy, are themselves products of minds embedded within the system they attempt to describe, making the observer and the observed eternally entangled in ways that no amount of scientific objectivity can fully untangle. Perhaps this is why the Anthropic Principle has proven so resistant to dismissal despite its logical circularity. It captures something true about the inescapable reflexivity of consciousness studying itself, a truth that no amount of methodological rigor can fully escape, and suggests that the deepest questions about existence may require us to accept that observer and observed are not separate categories we can cleanly partition, but rather two aspects of a single mystery that reveals itself only through their entanglement. In this light, the Anthropic Principle ceases to be merely an explanatory principle and becomes instead a mirror held up to the nature of inquiry itself, reminding us that every question we ask about the universe is ultimately a question about what kinds of minds could possibly ask such questions, and that this recursive loop of self-reference may not be a flaw in our reasoning, but rather the authentic signature of consciousness encountery. Imagine standing in an infinite library where every book represents a possible universe, and almost all of them are utterly dead and lifeless, containing only radiation and void and the cold mathematical substrate of existence itself. Yet somehow we find ourselves in the one library aisle where the pages happen to be filled with galaxies and stars and conscious beings capable of reading those very pages, and the deeper physicists look into the fundamental constants of reality. The more they discover that if the strength of gravity were even fractionally different, if the charge of an electron varied by the tiniest increment, if the ratio between matter and antimatter shifted by even 1 part in a billion, then there would be no atoms, no chemistry, no molecules, no stars, no planets, no biology, and certainly no observers to wonder about their own improbable existence at all. The fine-tuning problem describes this haunting observation that the universe appears calibrated to an almost incomprehensible degree of precision, as if someone had tuned the dial of each physical constant with microscopic care to permit complexity and consciousness to emerge from the void. Yet we have no mechanism to explain why these particular values were chosen rather than any of the infinite other configurations that would have resulted in a sterile cosmos. The psychological mechanism that allows us to coexist with this paradox operates through a kind of temporal inversion of logic, where we reverse cause and effect and tell ourselves that, of course, we observe a universe fine-tuned for observers, because if it were not fine-tuned for observers, we would not be here to observe it. A statement that is technically true, but somehow sidesteps the deeper mystery of why the universe was fine-tuned at all rather than following some neutral default setting where life should be vanishingly improbable. We have learned to accept this through multiple intellectual frameworks that each seem reasonable in isolation, whether we invoke the multiverse theory, where countless alternate universes exist in parallel, and we simply happen to find ourselves in the one that is habitable, or we suggest that perhaps conscious observers play some mysterious role in the collapse of quantum states and the selection of physical constants. Or we propose that intelligence itself might be far more common than we assume, and that the problem is not the universe's improbability, but our failure to understand how readily life emerges from chaos. Yet despite these explanatory attempts, a quiet unease persists beneath our rational acceptance, a sense that we are whistling past a profound cosmological graveyard, that we have dressed up our profound perplexity in the language of probability and multiverse mechanics, rather than genuinely resolving the vertiginous feeling that existence itself seems almost too unlikely to be random, and in this state of normalized bewilderment, we continue our daily lives secure in the knowledge that the universe is precisely calibrated to keep us alive, while remaining fundamentally uncertain whether this is the universe accommodating life or life accommodating itself to whatever universe happened to exist. Perhaps this uncertainty is precisely where the fine-tuning problem reveals its true nature. Not as a puzzle awaiting solution, but as a mirror reflecting the limits of how far rational explanation can reach before it encounters the irreducible mystery of why there is something rather than nothing. And we stand before that threshold perpetually, our instruments and equations growing more sophisticated with each generation, yet the fundamental question receding at the same pace, as if calibrated by the same invisible hand. Perhaps what we ultimately learn from the fine-tuning problem is not an answer about the universe itself, but a humbling recognition that consciousness may have reached the very edge of what it can understand about its own origins, and that this boundary itself, this place where explanation dissolves into mystery, might be the most honest and profound truth we can articulate about our strange and improbable existence. In this regard, the fine-tuning problem ceases to be merely a question about physics and becomes instead a question about the nature of understanding itself. Whether the human mind, being itself a product of these improbably calibrated constants, possesses the necessary conceptual architecture to comprehend the very mechanism that brought it into being, or whether we are forever trapped in a strange loop where the observer cannot step o. Imagine a woman named Beauty who volunteers for a strange experiment conducted by a team of researchers, and she agrees to the following terms. She will be put into a deep sleep on a Sunday evening, and then a fair coin will be flipped to determine what happens next. If the coin lands on heads, she will be awakened on Monday, asked a single question about her credence that the coin landed on heads, and then given a memory-erasing drug that will make her forget this entire Monday awakening before being put back to sleep and allowed to wake naturally on Wednesday morning. However, if the coin lands on tails, the experimenters will awaken her on Monday, ask her the same question about her credence regarding the coin flip, erase her memory, put her back to sleep, then awaken her again on Tuesday, ask the question once more, erase her memory again, and then let her wake naturally on Wednesday. The crucial element of this puzzle is that Beauty has no way of knowing which day of the week it currently is when she awakens, and she cannot remember how many times she has already been awakened during this experiment. From her subjective perspective, every awakening is identical and indistinguishable from every other awakening that might occur. This creates a profound epistemic problem that has troubled philosophers and probabilists for decades, because it forces us to confront the relationship between objective probability and subjective experience in ways that seem to violate our intuitions about how rational belief should function. When Beauty is awakened and asked what credence she assigns to the proposition that the coin landed on heads, there are two compelling but mutually exclusive answers that reasonable people defend with equal conviction. One group of philosophers argues that Beauty should assign a credence of 1/2 to heads, reasoning that the coin flip was genuinely fair before the experiment began, and no new information she receives upon awakening can change the objective probability of a fair coin landing on heads, which is eternally and unchangeably 1/2. However, another equally sophisticated group of thinkers contends that Beauty should assign a credence of only 1/3 to heads, because if she considers all possible awakenings across all possible runs of the experiment, she is twice as likely to be awakening on a tail experiment day than on a head experiment day, given that tails produces two awakenings, while heads produces only one. This puzzle persists in philosophical literature because it reveals a deep tension between how we think probability should work in objective reality and how it should operate in subjective experience. And despite numerous attempted resolutions involving anthropic principles, indexical information, and careful distinctions between different types of probability, no consensus answer has emerged that satisfies all the criteria we intuitively believe a correct answer should satisfy. The problem has spawned ingenious variants, such as asking what credence beauty should assign if the coin is flipped multiple times, or if she's told the experiment will be repeated across many weeks, and each variation seems to pull intuition in different directions, suggesting that our ordinary concepts of probability and self-location may not be fine-grained enough to capture the full complexity of reasoning from within a subjective perspective, where identical experiences can correspond to radically different objective situations. The problem also serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of idealized rationality. Even perfectly rational agents with complete information about the experiment's structure face genuine uncertainty about how to apply probability theory to their own situation, suggesting that some puzzles may reflect fundamental ambiguities in our concepts rather than failures of reasoning. This insight has implications far beyond abstract philosophy. It suggests that questions about personal identity, risk assessment in scenarios with memory loss, and even the interpretation of quantum mechanics, where observers in different branches of reality face analogous puzzles about which branch they inhabit, may all hinge on resolving the same fundamental ambiguity about how to reason when your subjective perspective underdetermines your objective situation. Some researchers have even suggested that the Sleeping Beauty problem might illuminate how to think about anthropic reasoning in cosmology, where observers trying to estimate their position in an infinite universe face eerily similar logical puzzles. Consider the possibility that the very fabric of existence as we understand it exists in a state of precarious equilibrium, suspended within a quantum field that is not actually stable but merely metastable, meaning that at any moment without warning or cause, the universe could transition from its current state into a lower energy state, a process known as vacuum decay, and this transition would manifest as a bubble of true vacuum expanding outward at the speed of light, obliterating all matter and energy in its path, rewriting the fundamental constants of physics themselves as it propagates. The mechanism behind this phenomenon emerges from quantum field theory, which describes reality not as solid objects but as fields permeating all space, and these fields exist at energy levels that could theoretically be reduced to a lower state, much like a ball perched on a hilltop might roll down to a valley below, and if this occurred anywhere in the observable universe, even in the most distant galaxy billions of light-years away, an expanding sphere of destruction would inevitably reach Earth eventually, and there would be no warning, no escape, no possibility of prevention because the very laws of physics would change within the expanding bubble, making life impossible and all structures fundamentally impossible. What makes this concept particularly paradoxical is that we continue living entirely unaffected by this possibility, building civilizations and planning futures despite the theoretical certainty that this event could occur at any moment, and physicists themselves continue their work with the acknowledgement that the universe might not be stable. Yet this knowledge produces no behavioral change in human society, no shift in how we allocate resources or structure our concerns. Because the threat is so utterly beyond our control and so incomprehensibly distant in probability that our minds simply do not register it as relevant to daily existence. We have normalized the possibility of absolute universal annihilation into a mere intellectual curiosity, a thought experiment discussed in academic circles and popular science forums, but one that never truly penetrates our decision-making processes or emotional awareness, existing in that strange space where we simultaneously accept its theoretical possibility while completely disregarding it in practice. Perhaps this represents the ultimate expression of humanity's cognitive limitation. We are neurologically equipped to fear predators and social rejection, to worry about next season's harvest or tomorrow's meeting, but we lack the mental architecture to genuinely internalize threats so vast and impersonal that they dwarf even the heat death of stars, leaving vacuum decay to exist in that peculiar category of knowledge that we acknowledge but cannot truly feel, and thus cannot truly fear. Yet this cognitive gap might itself be a form of mercy, a psychological circuit breaker that prevents us from being paralyzed by contemplation of the truly uncontrollable, allowing us instead to invest meaning in the finite span of existence we can actually influence and comprehend. And perhaps in this acceptance of our cosmic vulnerability lies an unexpected wisdom. The recognition that meaning is not diminished by impermanence but rather defined by it, that the fragility of existence is what makes our choices, relationships, and creative acts matter at all, transforming vacuum decay from a paralyzing cosmic horror into a silent counterweight that quietly justifies why we build, why we love, and why we continue. In this way, vacuum decay becomes not an argument for nihilism, but its unexpected antidote, a cosmic reminder that we need not wait for permission from a stable universe to declare our lives meaningful, and that perhaps the most profound human achievement is not the conquest of mortality or the prevention of entropy, but the deliberate choice to create beauty and connection in full knowledge that neither will endure forever. This is what gives weight to every conversation held beneath the stars, every equation solved in the pursuit of understanding, every act of kindness performed in the darkness. They are all assertions of meaning made in the face of a universe that offers no guarantees, declarations of defiance whispered into the void, and perhaps the most honest response to vacuum decay is not despair, but this quiet, persistent insistence on mattering anyway. Imagine a scenario in which a decision you make today is justified by an outcome that hasn't yet occurred, but the outcome only occurs because you made that decision in the first place, creating a loop where cause and effect seem to chase their own tails through time in a way that defies our conventional understanding of how causality should operate. This is Bootstrap Causality, a phenomenon that exists not merely in theoretical physics or philosophical thought experiments, but in the everyday patterns of human decision-making, institutional behavior, and cultural evolution, where we often find ourselves trapped in circular reasoning that somehow manages to feel perfectly rational while we're inside it. Consider the example of a self-fulfilling prophecy in financial markets, where investors believe a particular stock will rise, so they purchase it in large quantities, which causes the price to rise, which then validates their original belief retroactively, making them feel as though their initial decision was justified by the outcome it created rather than by any external evidence. The mechanism at work here operates through a peculiar fold in our cognitive architecture, where we are remarkably skilled at constructing narratives backward from results, convincing ourselves that we possessed foresight when we merely possessed luck, and that our reasoning was sound when it was actually circular. What makes bootstrap causality particularly insidious is that it bypasses our usual fact-checking mechanisms because the outcome itself becomes the evidence, creating an unbroken chain where each link justifies the one before it, and we find no obvious point at which to insert skepticism or doubt. We see this pattern emerge in organizational culture, where a company believes it hires the best talent, so it attracts ambitious people who want to work there, and these ambitious people then perform exceptionally, which confirms that the company does indeed hire the best talent, when in truth the causality may be running in multiple directions simultaneously or may be far more complex than the simple narrative we've constructed. The persistence of bootstrap causality, despite its fundamental irrationality, speaks to something profound about how human consciousness works, how we are narrative creatures who require stories that make sense, and how we are willing to accept circular logic if it comes wrapped in the right emotional packaging or social consensus, creating vast structures of belief and behavior that rest entirely on their own self-perpetuating foundations. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of bootstrap causality is that we cannot easily escape it once we recognize it, because the very act of believing we've identified it may itself become another self-fulfilling loop. The more we scrutinize our reasoning for circularity, the more we convince ourselves of our intellectual honesty, when we may simply be performing a more sophisticated version of the same self-justification we sought to expose. Yet perhaps this inescapability is not entirely a trap. It may instead suggest that bootstrap causality is not a failure of reasoning, but rather an unavoidable feature of how intentional beings navigate an uncertain world, where we must sometimes act as though our beliefs are justified in order to generate the very evidence that would make them so, collapsing the distinction between creating reality and discovering it. In this light, the entrepreneur who launches a business despite lacking guaranteed success operates within bootstrap causality. Their confidence itself becomes contagious, attracting investors and customers who might never have believed in an untested idea, yet whose belief transforms it into something real, suggesting that some of humanity's greatest achievements are built not on prior certainty, but on the willingness to act as though they were possible until they became so. This collapse of the boundary between belief and reality raises a fundamental question. Whether we should view bootstrap causality as a cognitive weakness to be overcome or as an essential tool for navigating worlds that don't yet exist, and whether the very concept of justified belief might need to expand to include those moments when conviction itself becomes the justification, transforming what looks like circular reasoning into something more like a creative act that brings new possibilities into being.